unity and determination in the response.
Welcome to the 22nd Unity for J Online Vigil for WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. I'm Joe Loria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss, freelance journalist and contributor to Consortium News and co-host of Unity 4J.
Julian Assange is wanted. He's still wanted because he's published classified information given to him by whistleblowers that reveal crimes and corruption of government officials around the world, not just in the US.
But in the US, it is the US, the supposed beacon of freedom and democracy and press freedom around the globe, that wants him extradited to the United States for the crime of publishing. He has interfered with the interests of some of the most powerful people in the world by revealing their machinations to the public.
That's why Julian Assange has been a refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the past 6 years, though he's not been charged with a crime by either the UK or Sweden. He knows that the second he steps back onto British territory, he'll be arrested and sent to the US, where he's unlikely to receive a fair trial and would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Those powerful interests want him to pay.
It is a historic test of press freedom. The corporate media, which once profited from him, has now abandoned Julian Assange, and they could face the same threat to their freedom to publish classified information were he to be arrested.
We'll now turn to the headlines related to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange of the past week. Yesterday, here in the US, marked 1 year since Julian Assange had his voice silenced online by the government of Ecuador.
And in the past week, we've also had special insight into the conditions in which Assange is living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London by way of a report by Cassandra Fairbanks, a journalist who will be joining us later in the vigil to discuss it. Her report was corroborated by WikiLeaks. Cassandra describes being locked in a room at the embassy for an hour earlier this week as she was attempting to meet with Assange. She writes, quote, "A few moments later, Assange walked by the door but could not enter. Embassy staff demanded that he submit to a full body scan with a metal detector before allowing him in the room. They have not done this with any other visitor in the nearly 7 years that he has lived there, including on my previous visits." He said, I don't want to do a body scan. It is undignified and not appropriate. She heard Assange say. He continued, "I am just trying to have a private meeting with a journalist." The door was slammed shut by someone from the embassy, and Cassandra decided to sit and wait. Not only would they not let Assange in to see her without a body scan, they also forced his lawyer to be scanned before he could come in to update her on the situation. After roughly 20 minutes, the lawyer came in and informed her that they were demanding to search Assange. Moreover, they would not be permitted to talk anywhere outside the highly surveilled room where the Ecuadorians had confined her. Agreeing to these draconian terms would set a bad precedent, so he was unsure if the meeting would go ahead. After appraising me of the situation, he left the room.
Quoting Cassandra directly, she writes, "A bit later, I decided to leave the room myself for an update from embassy staff. I quickly discovered that the door was locked from the outside. So I went to the second door. That was locked too. That was when I realized that Ecuadorian officials had deliberately imprisoned me in a room. As this ominous realization dawned on me, I heard a dramatic confrontation unfolding outside. Quote, "What are you frightened of in relation to me meeting with a journalist? What is the embassy afraid of?" Assange asks. I can't hear the response. Assange is arguing that as a political refugee, the embassy has a duty to protect him, not to treat him as a prisoner. Is this a prison? Assange asks. It's not, they reply. You know it's not. The visit to the publisher had in fact become eerily similar to visits I have made to inmates at federal penitentiaries in the US. It seemed our government was getting what they wanted from Ecuador. As a former senior State Department official told BuzzFeed in January, quote, as far as we're concerned, he's in jail.
Cassandra continued writing, quote, Assange, clearly agitated, demands to know, why are you surveilling me speaking to a US journalist? Do you think it's unreasonable for me to expect privacy when I meet with a journalist? Why are you silent? The embassy staff member responded that he can't say anything. And then Assange continues, why can't you say anything? Don't you have an excuse? What is the basis? Why are you surveilling an American journalist? What reason should we tell her? Assange asks. The conversation becomes hard to hear as I am still locked in the room. Assange's lawyer is also being searched again outside the room, though I can only hear bits and pieces of that conversation. He comes back in with a glass of water and tells me to hang tight. I feel like a prisoner receiving a visit. Finally, someone from the embassy comes in and tells me that I need to go to the lobby so that the ambassador could meet with Assange in the room with the cameras and the bugs. I see Assange in passing in the lobby and say hi, but it's cut short as he is directed to the conference room. Still phoneless, I glance at the clock and notice that it's 4:19 p.m. I was locked in the room for over an hour. Lobby and say hi, but it's cut short.
Sitting in the lobby, Cassandra writes, I hear much of the conversation, so I begin to take notes. Is this a prison? Is this how you treat a prisoner, not a political refugee? Assange demands. Ambassador Jaime Alberto Marchan retorts, is saying, this a prison? Quote, it's for our protection. Is this how you treat a prisoner, not a political? At this point, clearly frustrated, Assange asserts, I am trying to have a private conversation with a journalist. I am also a journalist, and you're stopping me from doing my work. How can I safely relay my mistreatment and the illegality going on here to this journalist while under surveillance? One of the issues, as Cassandra writes, it seemed, is that Assange wanted to bring a small radio into the conference room to muffle our voices so the microphone surveilling the room wouldn't pick up what we were saying as easily. There also appears to be concern that he will share stories with other journalists now that they have him muzzled and gagged. Quote, this is Assange, quote, you are preventing this journalist from meeting with me in any other room, Assange says, but only part of the conversation is audible at this point, as someone cleaning decided they needed to jingle keys and make a ton of noise for several minutes. You have been illegally surveilling me, Assange sternly insists. I want you to shut up, the ambassador says. I know you want me to shut up. The Ecuadorian president has already gagged me, Assange fired back. I'm banned from producing journalism. This is an extraordinary insight, Elizabeth, into the conditions that Assange is currently living. And I have never seen anything as detailed as this. I doubt anyone in the public has seen something like that aside from his lawyers and the few visitors that he's been allowed.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that Cassandra had the presence of mind to write down notation of what she was hearing at the time. I don't know that all journalists would have had the presence of mind to do that. And I know that it's really important to emphasize that this was something that was totally unique and a new level of censure compared to even Cassandra's earlier visits to the embassy.
Yeah, it shows the hell. I'm sorry, it shows the hell that they are trying to create for him, so he will have to leave on his own. So they do not look like they're kicking him out, which would be illegal under international law. And this is the situation they've put him in.
Absolutely. And in other headlines this week as well, but it was a very busy week. It's 3 weeks ago today that Chelsea Manning was jailed for refusing to testify at a grand jury sitting in Alexandria, Virginia, to bring charges against Assange for the publication of classified information.
At the time Chelsea Manning went into prison again, she said, quote, I will not participate in a secret process that I morally object to, particularly one that has been used to entrap and persecute activists for protected political speech. It is assumed that the prosecutors want her to implicate WikiLeaks and Julian Assange in her obtaining classified information that she turned over to WikiLeaks regarding Afghanistan, Iraq, the State Department cables. On another headline, WikiLeaks tweeted yesterday, Julian Assange to be arrested. Ecuadorian state media, the foreign minister and the vice president all suggest that Assange should be arrested for exposing alleged offshore corruption in the president's family and an attempt to sell Assange to the US government. This is a new release by WikiLeaks called the INA Papers, and it implicates President Lenin Moreno's family. Clearly something that will infuriate them, and in fact may have had something to do, I'm just speculating here, with the ambassador's angry exchange Assange that we just read about. Another quote, another tweet from WikiLeaks is that Ecuador's presidential spokesman claimed Thursday night that Maduro, that's the president of Venezuela, Assange, and the country's opposition leader, Mashi Rafael, are trying to bring down the government after an embarrassing offshore and lavish spending scandal. That's the INA Papers. So the Ecuadorian presidential spokesman is accusing Assange of trying to bring down the Ecuadorian government, the very government that has radically changed the conditions under which he lives, as opposed to the previous government.
And I think one thing that's really astounding about that too is that this actually was, to my understanding, was not a publication that by WikiLeaks, but the WikiLeaks account simply tweeted about it, and the Ecuadorian government is blowing that up into an excuse to potentially, expel Assange from the embassy. It seems.
Well, no, I was incorrect about that. So that was not a WikiLeaks publication. Simply retweeting has brought this reaction from the Ecuadorian government. Extraordinary. That's the reason they gagged Assange, so that he couldn't tweet, retweet, comment on political affairs, which is what a journalist does. As he said in that quote from Cassandra, he's not allowed to do his job, which is journalism. Of course, they are shutting him up, and a year ago yesterday began shutting him up because of his criticisms of Spain and the US, two allies of Ecuador. That's how Lenin Moreno put it when the decision to shut Assange down was made in March of 2018. Another headline, and this would normally have been the top headline, Elizabeth, if we didn't have these other dramatic issues. But last week, of course, just a few hours after the last vigil ended, word came out from Attorney General Barr here in the US that Robert Mueller, after 2 years of investigating the alleged conspiracy between Russia and the Trump campaign, was not true. There would be no charges of collusion against anybody in the Trump campaign. The collusion conspiracy theory collapsed. WikiLeaks tweeted that the #1 false story that emanated from this media fiasco of over 2 years was that Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort visited Julian Assange 3 times in the Ecuadorian embassy. WikiLeaks is running a GoFundMe campaign to pay for a lawsuit against The Guardian for that false story. The Guardian has refused to take the story down or respond to a barrage of criticism, even after last weekend's news about Mueller's report that there was no collusion, which also happened to be the title of the New York Times bestseller by Luke Harding, the Guardian journalist, whose name was on that false story about Manafort visiting Assange. So his book was called Collusion, and there wasn't any. But there wasn't a book. There was just a fairy tale there. He basically interviewed, by the way, Christopher Steele about the opposition research, where this all began, and it was paid for by the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee, based on opposition research, which is notoriously full of distortions, exaggerations, partly true, never to be taken seriously. Even Christopher Steele himself said that he believed only 70% of that report was accurate. Can you imagine, Elizabeth and me, if we went to an editor somewhere and we said, well, here's my story. I think only 70% of it is true. Please publish it.
No, well, I can't imagine.
You know what would happen to that story? Would be crumbled and thrown into the trash bin.
Well, at CNN, you'd probably get a promotion, unfortunately. But...
Oh, yeah.
So in addition, our final headline for the day is that obviously yesterday marked the year since Julian Assange had been silenced by the Ecuadorian government. And in honor of that, March 29 and 30th, which is today and tomorrow, there's a rally held to spend 2 days and 2 nights outside the Ecuadorian embassy in London. So if you're in the UK and you can make it, please head down to number 3 Hans Crescent and show your support and solidarity with Assange.
That's going on now. So in addition to Cassandra Fairbanks. We're scheduled to be joined today by CIA torture whistleblower John Kiriakau. And we're very happy to have Lisa Johnson on, an Australian psychologist, and she'll be speaking about her 5-part series that ran in the New Matilda called The Psychology of Getting Julian Assange. It's gotten a lot of great reviews from Assange supporters. It's quite an incisive series, and we're really happy for her to join us later, hopefully for a full hour to discuss in detail those 5-part series. We're also scheduled to be joined by Tim Canova. He's a lawyer and an activist, and he challenged Debbie Wasserman Schultz in a Democratic primary for a Florida seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Wasserman Schultz, of course, was forced to resign as chairwoman of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, right after the publication of the DNC emails by WikiLeaks, which was just before the start of the Democratic National Convention that nominated Hillary Clinton, or coronated Hillary Clinton, in July of 2016. And our last bit of news, which just broke an hour or so ago, was that Susie Dawson, who was, of course, one of the founders of the Unity for J Vigils, has, like Christine Assange, Julian's mother, a week or so ago, has had her Twitter account restricted. Same exact notification as appeared when Christine Assange's account had been restricted for 24 hours. We don't know anything more than that, but that's just the latest news. We are waiting for our first guest, Elizabeth, so we can go on and talk, I think, between ourselves about some of these stories. So,
no, absolutely. We have Tim with us now. I'm going to bring on, happy to speak with Tim Canova.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll have no issues with audio as we've had for the last couple of weeks since Zoom had an update.
Here he comes.
We see a wall. Hi, Tim.
Yes, it looks like my wall. It's white. But we don't see Tim. So while we were waiting for Tim, who I'll ask to introduce himself to the audience, he may not be well known outside the U.S. I can't wait for Cassandra to come on, Elizabeth, because as I said just a while ago, I've never gotten that kind of insight to what's going on at the embassy. Do you know of anyone who's revealed that kind of detail? Oh, by the way, I should add that WikiLeaks has corroborated the facts of her article in a tweet.
Right.
So there's no doubt that this happened. And I'm kind of surprised that we got to learn this, to be honest with you. It's very rare to get that kind of insight, situation like that. And the courage of this guy to criticize the ambassador in such a strong way, which he no doubt deserves. He is acting like an agent of the U.S., but it just shows you where Julian's at, what his mind is like right now, and the pressures he's under, and the courage to speak to that ambassador to his face. We would love to hear the courage of Tim Canova in a few minutes, but we're just seeing a white wall.
At the moment, yeah, and
it's like talking to a wall, isn't it? It's like talking to a wall when it comes to Tim Canova. Okay,
we'll have it sorted out very quickly. But as there's so much happened this week. We saw in the last week we've seen this plane that was the same jet that apparently was the plane that was intended to be a grab team vehicle for the attempted pickup of Edward Snowden. We saw the gagging of Christine Assange on Twitter for over 24 hours. And now, as Joe mentioned earlier, we see that Susie Dawson's Twitter is also restricted. So it's definitely an intense week, an intense few weeks that we've had.
Yeah, that plane apparently was sent to London to pick up a pedophile suspect from Ireland who's sent to the UK and then back to the US. Looks like we have Tim here. Tim, can you hear us?
I do. I hear you. Do you hear me?
Fantastic. Yes.
I'm sorry for my delay in patching in. I was having some technical problems.
Well, there's nothing new there. Yeah.
We're used to that here.
Yeah. Tim, can you please, you're quite well known in the US, but maybe not outside the US, and our audience is all over the world. Just tell us a little bit about your background and also why you're here. In other words, why do you support WikiLeaks?
Okay. Well, thank you, Joe and Elizabeth. So I am a law professor. I've been teaching for the past couple of decades. And in 2016, I decided to challenge Debbie Wasserman Schultz in a Democratic primary for Congress. Wasserman Schultz, I'm sure most of your listeners and viewers remember her. She was the chair of the Democratic National Committee in 2016, and we challenged her in a primary. It was a very hard-fought race. Bernie Sanders endorsed me. I had been a Sanders supporter from the beginning, and we raised a lot of money in small donations, and we fell short at the end. The DNC leaks exploded really right during the home stretch. The primary was at the end of August in 2016. Our internal field numbers showed us winning and running away at the end. So it seemed a bit suspicious. And a couple of months after the election, I put in a public records request to inspect the ballot, which is the right of every Florida citizen. I should have mentioned that this race is in South Florida. That's where I live, and that's where the congressional district is. And we had to actually sue to try to see these ballots. And while the lawsuit was pending, the Broward supervisor of elections at the time, someone named Brenda Snipes, destroyed all the paper ballots. So we ran again in 2018, this time as an independent instead of a Democratic primary. There was very little polling that was done. One Republican poll was reported to show me running neck and neck with Wasserman Schultz at 34% each, with a couple of weeks to go. And it seemed like all the momentum was behind us at the end, at our back. When the polls closed an hour later, it showed us getting only 5% of the vote, which seemed ridiculous. Turns out we were capped at 5% in every single demographic group. So our experts are telling us that was mathematically impossible. So that's what it's like running against the establishment here in South Florida. I was a supporter of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange for many years. I was going back to, I guess, the Bush administration when WikiLeaks was coming out with material on the war in Iraq. So I'm a big believer in transparency and open government. I have a lot of respect for what Julian Assange and the rest of the team at WikiLeaks has been doing for all these years. I think it's outrageous that he's being held in confinement. And it is, I've spoken out many times, including during the campaigns, that this is a terrible attack on free speech and the free press.
Now, of course, Debbie Wasserman Schultz was forced to resign as the chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee once the DNC emails were published by WikiLeaks just before the convention, the nominating or the coronation, I should say, not the nomination of Hillary Clinton. Do you think, first of all, that hurt her in her primary with you? And how did she survive that? And what does it tell you about what they were up to and what WikiLeaks revealed about the DNC?
I've given it some thought. I'm not sure it had a major impact on the race. I think I think most of the folks who were supporting me, both in the district and around the country, were already of the mind that Debbie Wasserman Schultz had been rigging the primaries against Bernie Sanders. And I had a lot of support coming my way as a result. And we had already raised a lot of money in small donations online we ended up raising almost $4 million from over 200,000 individual contributions. When the WikiLeaks drop came, of course, it was very embarrassing for Wasserman Schultz, and she was booed off the stage even before the convention started and had to resign, as you know. What it revealed, well, I'll tell you, my name shows up a couple of hundred times, I think, in that DNC leak. I don't know exactly how many times, 100 or 200 times, something like that. It showed the DNC was surveilling our campaign. I believe our campaign was the subject of a number of dirty tricks and kind of cheating, I guess you could say. Wasserman Schultz's team infiltrated our campaign at some very high levels. They certainly monitored and spied on our campaign. Our campaign came under denial of service attacks down the home stretch. And that was just the first campaign. The second campaign, I think we were up against even stronger headwinds. I think we were blacklisted by the mainstream media, shadow banned on social media, throttled. There was all kinds of shenanigans going on with our web pages and our online fundraising. It always seemed like something was amiss, that we were under some kinds of attacks that we were having trouble identifying and combating. So these folks don't play fair. Wasserman Schultz was constantly running away from debates. In the first campaign, we managed to get her for a very short debate, about a half an hour on TV, hidden on a Sunday morning. And the second debate completely dodged them 100%. You know, I think the WikiLeaks disclosures, in some ways they helped us. I suppose it did add to the support that was already building very quickly in our favor. On the other hand, I imagine, you know, the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, the intelligence community, private internet security that Wasserman Schultz's team was paying for, all of those forces came to bear on us, maybe even more than they would have if not for that scandal. It's hard to tell, but you know, look, I think we very well may have won that first campaign. It might have been stolen. Certainly the circumstantial evidence and statistical evidence suggests it. And that's why they had to destroy all the paper ballots. So I would not put any of the onus on the outcome on the WikiLeaks, on the DNC leaks.
Had to be the Russians then. Of course, I'm joking. But before I turn over to Elizabeth, you did make first of all, you learned from the WikiLeaks release of the emails that they were surveilling your campaign. And then didn't you mount a legal challenge when you just found out that those ballots had been destroyed?
We did, and we won in Florida Circuit Court. The judge actually granted a summary judgment, but there wasn't much relief the judge could give. The point of the lawsuit was to inspect the ballots, and while the lawsuit was pending, about 3 months after we filed the lawsuit, and only 3 days after we served the Broward Supervisor of Elections with a discovery request, and the ballots were part of the discovery request, that's when the supervisor destroyed all those paper ballots. At least that's her version of events. She destroyed the ballots on September 1st, 2017, and did not disclose it to the court or to us for another 2 months, more than 2 months. So the Florida Circuit Court granted a summary judgment, which really just opened the door for us to collect our attorney's fees from Broward County. There wasn't much other relief they could give since the ballots, the point of the lawsuit, the ballots were destroyed. But in the judge's ruling, the judge ruled that Brenda Snipes, the Supervisor of Elections, had violated numerous state and federal criminal statutes, some of them felony statutes. We fully expected at that time for our second campaign to break wide open, that the authorities, the law enforcement authorities at both the federal and state levels would open up criminal investigations. And we were hoping that criminal probes would cast some light on the rigging in 2016 and prevent similar kinds of rigging in 2018. Our experts believe the rigging was done through manipulation of the software of the electronic voting machines. To our dismay, there was no federal inquiries by the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Florida Attorney General's Office, or the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. So what does that say to us about the rule of law in this country right now? If you're wealthy, if you're politically connected and powerful, the rules just don't apply to you.
Well, that's an interesting point because, as we know, the false Russiagate scandal has consumed the press and all of the establishment media outlets for the last 2.5, going on 3 years. So it's fascinating to hear about real election interference from your experience that has, funnily enough, gained no traction in the media whatsoever. Do you have any perspective on why exactly you think that is, especially when you've raised concerns about the involvement of the State Department in actually quashing investigation and prosecution of people like Brenda Snipes in your case?
Yes, my election lawyer in that first campaign and throughout the litigation against Broward County Supervisor of Elections was or is a Republican, and a well-connected one in the state of Florida. And I was frustrated that the Republicans from Tallahassee down to Broward County just seemed to fall completely silent, especially right after we won our lawsuit, after we were granted summary judgment. And my lawyer looked into it and got back to me after a couple of weeks. And he told me, it was an interesting conversation. He said, Tim, the reason the Republicans are not going to get involved to help in any way is that they've got the same friends as Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And I said, what kind of friends are you talking about? Are you talking about Florida Power and Light and the Fanjul brothers, who are big billionaire sugar families here in Florida? These are traditionally two of the big power interests in the state of Florida who have contributed millions, tens of millions of dollars to Democrats and Republicans alike. And he basically didn't want to go there. He said it was the corporate lobbyists and the political consultants. And I nudged him a little bit and said, well, who do you think those folks, those corporate lobbyists represent? And he conceded that that was true. So these are the most powerful corporate interests in the state of Florida who would much rather see Debbie Wasserman Schultz remain in Florida in the House of Representatives than to reveal a scandal of how the voting machines are being rigged.
Absolutely. And I think that you've made the call multiple times for paper ballots to be counted in public, hand counted. Do you see any call for that amongst the media that has been for the last 3 years talking about nothing but alleged election interference?
Among the media, no. Among some politicians, there's some movement in that direction. Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who's running for president in the Democratic primaries, has introduced legislation that I believe would require paper ballots, although if I remember correctly, the ballots could either be counted or they could be backups to the machine counts. I think that Tulsi Gabbard bill might be moving in the right direction in requiring the software to be open software. Again, my recollection's a little fuzzy, but that's what I seem to recall about her bill. I think we shouldn't have any electronic voting machines, even open software. You know, they allow the state of Florida, well, let me back up and say the software in these machines are proprietary. They're owned by the private vendors. 5 or 6 major companies in this country run the voting machines, and they own the software. No one's allowed, the public is not allowed to inspect them. Now, the state of Florida may inspect the software prior to the election, but that doesn't mean that the software they're inspecting is the actual software that will be used during the election count. If there's any kind of wrongdoing, any kind of hacking from the outside or wrongdoing from the inside, they can manipulate just a few lines of source code to rig an election. And there's no way to find that out, even with open source software, I believe. So I really think it's much more preferable to just ban these electronic voting machines, as has been done in many European democracies, and to have a system of 100% hand-marked paper ballots that are counted by hand in public. And in this day and age, when everyone's a journalist, everyone's got a cell phone with a video camera, you can have a lot of transparency in the counting of those paper ballots. And ideally, you want to have them counted, right away once the polls close. You might not, of course, you wouldn't be able to get a result within an hour the way you do with these vulnerable electronic voting machines. You might have to wait a few hours, but I would think by midnight, you'd have your answers. People could wait a few hours to have a system of vote counting that's entirely transparent and verifiable. I'll also mention that I believe it was just yesterday, Donald Trump was being interviewed on Fox News, and he was asked about election integrity, and whether one believes him or not, he did say we need paper ballots. I think he indicated paper ballots as backups. So again, it's like the Tulsi Gabbard bill. It's moving in the right direction and recognizing that you can't just have these touch screens. You need to have paper ballots so that you can go back and audit them. But as long as you've got machines that are making the initial count, it leaves candidates and the public at the mercy of all kinds of other forces, as we saw in my first election, where the supervisor simply threw out the ballots and there's no investigation.
And not only was there no, go ahead, Joe.
No, please. Please,
I was going to say, not only was there no investigation, but during your second campaign, and some of our viewers may not be aware that the Brenda Snipes, who you're describing, who has not been charged with the felonies that the summary judgment found that she had committed, Brenda Snipes was openly campaigning on the campaign trail with Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So what do you make of that level of brazenness of the corruption in that process and in South Florida?
Thank you for mentioning that. That had slipped my mind. And that happened within a week or two of the election in 2018. There were photographs taken of Wasserman Schultz and Brenda Snipes, both in campaign shirts, basically hugging each other and campaigning together. You know, that a supervisor of elections would not even be concerned about the appearance of a conflict of interest, of bias, says an awful lot. When you can get away with destroying hundreds of thousands of ballots, violating federal and state law, violating a court order and a litigation hold on the ballots, when you get away with that scot-free, what can't you get away with? So it creates a moral hazard that encourages, it provides all kinds of incentives for criminal wrongdoing, for election fraud, when they know they got away with it last time. You know, I think it was Chris Hedges who said a few months ago that the corruption is so bad now that they don't even try to hide it. You know, and I imagine that's the lesson to learn from what's happened to our campaigns here in South Florida, that when you've got no rule of law, when law enforcement itself is on the side of the corrupt officials, you don't even have to really try to hide it. None of this really got reported in the mainstream press. We had to try to use social media to publicize all of this wrongdoing and the way Wasserman Schultz was campaigning openly with Brenda Snipes. Brenda Snipes finally came to the attention of the media, and that's because in November of 2018, the race for Florida governor and for the U.S. Senate in Florida both kind of crash landed in Broward County. Both those races were pretty much dead heats, very close, too close to call almost. And both races ended up having a machine recount in Broward County. And during these fateful days while they were doing the machine recount, Brenda Snipes kept finding thousands of more ballots that hadn't been counted. I imagine somebody who's willing to destroy ballots probably has no ethical restraint in producing fake ballots. So nobody really knew what was on the up and up. And at that point, the conservative media started to pay some attention to what was happening. There was a video that one of my campaign supporters had taken outside one of the voting sites right after the voting sites, the balloting closed. And it showed a line of cars pulling up and unloading ballots in the big blue satchels that the supervisor of elections uses. There was only one person in each car pulling up, unloading the ballots, and they were loading them up onto a rented truck. There didn't seem to be any chain of custody, no sheriff's deputy signing receipt for those ballots. Every election lawyer I spoke to who took a look at that video came to the conclusion that it was shocking that there was no chain of custody of the paper ballots. So you had no chain of custody on the paper ballots. The electronic voting machines in the state of Florida, every electronic voting machine now has wireless cellular modems on them. So hear me out, when you fill out a paper ballot and you hand it over to the election officials at the voting site, those election officials, right in your presence, feed them through a scanning machine, an electronic scanning machine that tabulates them. those scanning machines have wireless cellular modems on them. It's an open invitation for any sophisticated hacker to hack in, change a few lines of source code, and change the results of an election. And I don't mean just at the margins. They can change the results dramatically, as we believe they did in our election in November.
Sorry, you're muted, Joe. Just 1 second. It's not letting me unmute it. There we go. No, it keeps muting it. I'm so sorry. Tim, we know that Debbie Wasserman Schultz was photographed hugging a young Democrat named Evan Ross, I believe, in 2017. And Evan Ross had made death threats against Julian Assange. So this corruption is not something that only affects, constituents in South Florida. Through her role at the DNC, she has affected the entire country. So.
It's true. And Ross works for a corporate lobby firm and is very close allies with Wasserman Schultz. I look back at that DNC leak and the narrative that it wasn't a leak, it was a hack by the Russians, was invented by Debbie Wasserman Schultz in the DNC. And I have spoken out about this and written about it really almost ever since I became aware of it in 2016, that the FBI was not granted access to the DNC's servers. And I believe that was Jim Comey's FBI. Jim Comey testified to Congress that 3 times he requested access to the DNC servers and 3 times was denied. And I believe all 3 times was by Debbie Wasserman Schultz herself. So instead, the FBI had to rely on CrowdStrike, a private internet security firm that I believe is headed by a Ukrainian who is
Russian. He's a Russian.
Yeah,
he's not Ukrainian.
But okay, but hostile to the Putin regime.
Absolutely, Dmitry Alperovich. He's certainly hostile to Putin. Yes, and he's a fellow of the Atlantic Council. Is all you need to know.
Right. And when I point this out, I would point it out to fellow Democrats when I was still a Democrat before I went independent. And the response would be kind of, how can I describe it? I'll tell you what reminds me of it is during the Kavanaugh nomination. Now, I was an opponent of Judge Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court, but my opposition was based on his record as a judge and his judicial decisions. I wasn't getting into the allegations that were being made by Dr. Blasey Ford, allegations that went back something like 3 decades of what Kavanaugh may or may not have done in chasing her around at a party. But one of my supporters was trying to urge me to put out a statement, denouncing Kavanaugh for molesting Dr. Ford 30 years ago. And my response was, we don't know what happened yet. Ford hasn't even testified yet. And the supporter then responded to me and said, what does that matter if it stops Kavanaugh? And I find the same attitude when I talk about CrowdStrike. What does it matter if it was really a leak and not a hack? As long as it hurts Donald Trump and the Republicans, what does it matter? And, I think with this issue of whether it was a hack or a leak, it matters tremendously. First of all, there are victims. Julian Assange is the non-victim of this lie, of this narrative. That's most likely a lie, according to VIPs, the veterans of the intelligence professionals who have studied the metadata and believe that it was not a hack, it was a leak. And it matters not just to the way Julian Assange has been victimized personally, but it matters to all of us who care about the First Amendment, the freedom of the press, to report properly. So this is something that must not be swept under the rug, even now, years after it happened. It is still with us today, and we will not have a free press in this country with vigilant reporters who are willing to publish if this injustice is not reversed. There's a lot of talk now that the Mueller report is done. The Democrats want the Mueller report to be disclosed in its entirety. Republicans and the Trump administration are talking about declassifying the memos behind the FISA warrant application and the 302s, the FBI reports, the testimony of witnesses, the transcripts. All of that should be published. We need full transparency. But at the same time, we should have a real hearing on what happened with the DNC leaks. That this narrative, this lie that it was just a Russian hack based on the words of CrowdStrike, the findings of CrowdStrike, is ludicrous. This is an injustice that's still with us today. And I really think it's at the heart of everything that's wrong right now. All of the Mueller investigation, what's consumed this country for the past 2 years now, it all goes back to Debbie Wasserman Schultz's initial lie that it wasn't a hack. I'm sorry, that it was not a leak, that it was a hack.
You know, and that CrowdStrike determination was based on what they claimed was first a sophisticated operation, but however, the hackers left clues such as Cyrillic letters and the name of the first Soviet intelligence chief. Now, why would they do that if they were sophisticated hackers?
Right. Well, not only,
Just
yeah,
of course.
Not believable, not believable.
And that goes back to Vault 7, you know, where
Right.
we see that the intelligence community really has a modus operandi of trying to attribute their own hacks to foreign intelligence.
That's right. That could have happened.
And what's so funny about that particular document and Sean Henry's assertion that was, you know, hacked from the DNC, that was evidence of Russians hacking the DNC. What's so funny about that is that the particular document they're talking about is actually an attachment to a Podesta email. So there's no way that was taken from the DNC because it didn't come from the DNC in the first place. So the earliest, you know, allegations of Russian hacking are absolute fake news from start to finish. So
yeah, and even the Voice of America of all outlets reported that the same software that CrowdStrike used to determine that Russia had hacked the DNC was used on the battlefield. It was used to hack into a howitzer, and the Ukrainian, that the Russians, they claimed the Russians had hacked into Ukrainian howitzers on the battlefield in Donbass, but actually the Ukrainian military themselves said that wasn't true. So they had to rewrite the software that they had used in the DNC case. So it turned out to be false, and even, as I say, Voice of America reported that. We can dismiss that, I think, pretty clearly, that is not a credible source for proof, and that the FBI was kept away is highly, highly suspicious. You know, Tim, your whole story, yeah, go on.
And yet, the Mueller report and Adam Schiff, the Democratic House Intelligence Chair, they both have continued to repeat the DNC was hacked as you know, a conclusion. So this narrative remains a huge problem.
No kidding. Your narrative, what you've been telling us, is such a great insight into so many things that are wrong. As you said, they don't need to hide the corruption anymore. The police are with them, and the media is with them, and it's a bipartisan establishment that's protecting their interests against nosy reporters, real journalism against the people. That's right, trying to report to the people against a population that's becoming increasingly angry, increasingly upset with 30 years of these neoliberal economic policies that have destroyed the middle class or is destroying the middle class. And they see, I think, that this establishment, they're worried about what inevitably happens throughout any period in history when people at the top take too much for themselves. They're going to have a backlash. Yeah, and they got to. Yes, go on.
I agree entirely. I'm sorry to interrupt, Joe. I just wanted to agree and say that, you know, the rise of Donald Trump is a manifestation of that.
Absolutely.
Of what you're describing. You know, people have been left behind. You know, 8 years of Obama. I saw a video recently, just in the past couple of days. It was an interview that Obama gave while he was president, where maybe he gave it on Fox News, I can't remember, but he was trying to assure the interviewer that he's really not a radical. He's really not far on the left. He's really a moderate Republican. You know,
That's
and
right.
This is the problem. Both parties, you know, they act like they hate each other and they're at each other's throats. But on 95% of the issues that affect, especially the bread and butter issues that affect most of the American people, those two parties are on the side of huge corporate interests and not on the side of the people.
Now, I wonder if you can give us an insight into how much Debbie Wasserman Schultz must hate WikiLeaks. I mean, WikiLeaks cost her a job, and she is such an establishment figure. I mean, she stands in for many people, Republican or Democrat, as a defender of that. How much she must hate, and how much do they hate WikiLeaks?
Yeah, it's not only Wasserman Schultz, of course. You know, I'm sure Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi and the entire Democratic establishment, and they'll do anything but have an autopsy, an honest one, of their mistakes and their failures and what's wrong with the Democratic Party. They'll do anything but that. And, you know, I've said this time and again, that the Democratic Party, the establishment I'm talking about, it has two main objectives, a primary objective and a secondary objective. Their primary objective, above all else, is to defeat progressives in primaries, to defeat any movement that is in opposition to its corporate donor base. Its secondary opposition is to win general elections in November against Republicans, but it's only secondary. It's only secondary. As long as they achieve their primary objective, the gravy train of corporate money will keep coming in.
That's right. So I think and I said this before the election in 2016, that they would probably, the Democratic establishment would probably prefer Trump than Sanders as president, because he's not a threat to their personal interests, is he?
Yes.
Where Sanders might be.
I think you're right. Yeah. Yes, I agree. And, you know, I supported Bernie Sanders last time. He's been awfully quiet about the DNC's election rigging that happened in 2016 and in 2018. And under those circumstances, I don't see how it won't happen to him again.
I was going to ask you, did you ever talk to him about that, about the 2016, about what the emails say about how he was screwed? Did you ever speak with him?
No, I first met Bernie Sanders in 2011 as a law professor. My area of scholarly inquiry has been central banking and monetary policy and international trade and corporate governance. And I had worked with Sanders' staff in 2010 and the staff of Congressman Ron Paul and another congressman named Alan Grayson, a Democrat, on the Federal Reserve transparency provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act. So that's where, and a year later, Senator Sanders named me to an advisory committee on reforming the Federal Reserve. So I had a number of discussions with him and others on the committee, and we came out with some proposals, some which he accepted and some which he didn't. And then the next contact I had with him was 4 years later. I did not contact him when I was a candidate seeking an endorsement. I thought it would be foolhardy. I thought there would be no possibility that he would endorse an opponent to the head of the DNC when he was trying to get the Democratic nomination. And yet that's what happened in May of 2016 out of the blue. I got a call letting me know that he had just endorsed me, and then a few hours later he called me and we had a nice conversation. We spoke a bit about the campaign. We were hoping he was going to come to the district and campaign with me in public, and that seemed to be in the works. And then he backed away from that, and it happened right around the time of the Democratic National Convention. We had a couple of conversations, but it was clear that his hands were tied and he was not going to come down. So whatever carrots and sticks came his way at the time of the convention were probably pretty significant ones. And I imagine, they've kind of had him in a box ever since.
Yes, Elizabeth.
I was just going to say that is such an indictment of our, election integrity and its functionality as a democracy. And it's really shocking to me that this has basically gone unreported in establishment press for obvious reasons. What do you make of, and I don't mean to get into the weeds here, but what do you think about, and can you explain to our viewers, especially those who aren't residing in the US, about the significance of scandals that have plagued Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but that the establishment press has not covered in the last couple of years, including things like the Iran scandal? Because I think our international audience would really benefit from hearing about that and the process by which it was, dropped by the Trump administration's Department of Justice.
Yes, I'd be glad to address that. And the Iran scandal is really probably the primary one to talk about. Debbie Wasserman Schultz had hired a Pakistani-born IT specialist, although he didn't have much of a background in IT. His name is Imran Awan. And she hired him and helped him apparently get onto the staff of a number of other members of Congress. I believe Awan, his brother, his wife, I think another brother, together they were making among the highest salaries of any congressional staff. Awan was pulling in $160,000 or $165,000 a year, and his family, all combined, brought in about $5 million over just a few years. They had. I should say this, that in 2016, the House Inspector General of the House of Representatives started to investigate the Awans. And they determined that they had been engaged in some petty larceny of computer equipment, but not in significant amounts. But more disturbing, that they had violated House cybersecurity rules, and that Awan himself had access to the private emails of something like 44 members of Congress, including everyone on the House Intelligence Committee, and that he was accessing their private emails for long periods of time, months at a time, from Pakistan. So these were serious allegations, and not just allegations, the findings of the Inspector General, which we were hoping the Justice Department would investigate aggressively and would bring some kind of criminal prosecutions. There was an infamous incident where Wasserman Schultz, as a member of the House Subcommittee on Legislative Appropriations, was questioning the head of the Capitol Hill Police, who had just confiscated an iPad, I believe, or a laptop that they believed belonged to Imran Awan. It was found in a house, a closet in a hallway of Congress. It had a note by him on it, and she wanted it back. She claimed it was her equipment, not his, and she threatened dire consequences if it wasn't returned. So, it really reads like kind of a spy thriller to some degree. And I should say that there was one journalist that was really pursuing the story the entire time. And unfortunately, he was just about the only journalist in the country pursuing the story. He's come out with a very interesting book on it. His name is Luke Rosiak, and the book is called Obstruction of Justice. And it shows how the Justice Department under Sessions backed away from bringing any real charges. They had arrested Awan while he was in the process of trying to flee the country to Pakistan. His wife had already fled. They had him arrested for bank fraud, for lying on applications for, I think, bank loans. And we expected that there would be charges dealing with the cybersecurity scandal, which certainly seems to be the biggest cyber espionage scandal in congressional history. And at the end of the day, they charged him with, they settled, they dropped the charges. I think maybe I shouldn't say they dropped the charges. They basically
declined to
allowed
prosecute.
him off with, yeah, they declined to prosecute. It was a slap on the wrist, and they never brought any of the cybersecurity charges at all. So it certainly, the circumstantial evidence is that this guy was untouchable, that through his cybersecurity violations, he essentially had an espionage ring that was probably a blackmail and an extortion ring at the same time. and that members of the House of Representatives at the highest levels, the House leadership of both the Democratic side and the Republican side under Paul Ryan at the time, may have been compromised. They all had whatever private, personal reasons to pressure the Justice Department to do nothing with this scandal at all.
And meanwhile, we have, this scandal unprosecuted, and yet we have Julian Assange and WikiLeaks being prosecuted for simply doing journalism. It really is a stunning comparison when you understand those stories.
And yet another example that the rule of law just does not apply to the wealthy and the powerful, the politically connected. I got so tired of actually watching Barack Obama give these speeches about American exceptionalism and how we are the model, the paragon of a rule of law society. And it used to bother me when he would say that stuff because his first Attorney General, Eric Holder, famously failed to prosecute any Wall Street executives for, trillion-dollar frauds that destroyed the American economy and the global economy. But then it goes beyond just the failure to prosecute Wall Street. It gets to the point where we're talking about these kinds of cybersecurity violations, espionage rings, using WikiLeaks as a scapegoat for essentially political rigging, and ignoring blatant ballot destruction and rigging of electronic voting machines. I'm sorry to say that after 3 years as a candidate in 2 elections, that I can't in good conscience say the United States of America is a rule of law society or a democracy at this point.
Debbie got her computer back, right?
Debbie got her computer back. Exactly. She did.
And I'm left speechless, really.
Thank you for joining
one can only hope that the new Justice Department and FBI under new leadership finally maybe will be motivated to start looking into these things and not to sweep them under the rug. There's a lot of wishful and hopeful thinking in saying that, though.
Yeah, I was about to ask you whether you really do have hope. It seems hopeless to me, what you're describing here today.
Well, I must say that I get folks here in Florida who ask me if I'll endorse them or help them if they run for office. And it's gotten to the point where if you don't know if your ballot is actually being counted, the moment you let go of that ballot, the moment it goes through that first scanning machine, then what's the point of voting? And I really hate to say something like this, but if nothing changes, sooner or later, boycotting elections is going to be the only strategy that in good conscience would make sense. I just wonder, are we there already?
And unfortunately, we have that option.
There's always a boogeyman on the other side. If you're on the left of the spectrum, you're going to hate Trump to the point where you got to vote. You just got to, otherwise it empowers them. And if you are on the right side of the spectrum, you're looking at Hillary Clinton or whoever's going to be next, and you got to vote. You can't let her in, can't let them in. So that lesser of two evils type of psychology just keeps enough people voting. And yet you look at the 2016 election, 107 million Americans did not vote who were legally entitled to vote. And that's a lot more than the 60 million who voted for Donald Trump and the 61 million who voted for Hillary Clinton, roughly speaking. So already you've got a plurality of the American voting population that on some level or another thinks it's a waste of time, whether they have a well-developed grasp of the facts of the rigging of the system or not. On some gut level, they just think that their vote really doesn't much make a difference anymore.
And I believe you have, oh, go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just going to say that we have this expression here that America is a country, is a country ruled by laws, not men. You've heard that one, right? But every time I drive down 395, I see all these monuments to men here in Washington, to Jefferson, to Washington to Lincoln. And I wonder about that. I think for a long time, this has been a country ruled by men, and now by some women like Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And that laws, as you pointed out so aptly here, Tim, that the law doesn't apply to the rest, to them, only to us. I think there's going to be some kind of explosion unless somebody who at least appears to be progressive is elected president and tries to bring about real health care, national health insurance, tries to rein in corrupt money in politics, etc. That could delay things, but not necessarily improve things very much. But I think after Obama, as you pointed out, Obama was a fraud. So people know that now, I think. Some people do.
Some people do. I think what's more likely to happen if the Democrats continue on this Russia Gate narrative, which they seem to be willing to do even after the word of the Mueller report, Mueller's findings. I wouldn't be surprised if Donald Trump is going to win running away next time. But whoever wins or loses the 2020 election, I think there's likely to be we're watching another bubble develop in our financial markets and our asset markets. In many ways, nothing has really changed since the 2008 financial collapse. There's some safeguards, but they're not very significant, really. There seems to be a bubble again in securitization. This time it's collateralized corporate loans instead of mortgage-backed securities. If there's another financial collapse, in some ways it was a great opportunity in 2008. If Barack Obama had assumed the White House and pursued more like a Franklin Roosevelt bottom-up approach to the recovery, I don't think we'd have Donald Trump in the White House right now. Instead, he pursued a trickle-down approach. They took care of Wall Street. The Federal Reserve, it was unprecedented what the Federal Reserve did in the level of support, and not just to commercial banks, but to non-banks, to all kinds of financial markets. And not much of that trickled down. And instead, you still have a trickle-up economy where the broad middle class and working folks and the poor constantly are losing purchasing power, and the distribution of wealth and income gets more and more top-heavy, and more of our financial industry and other industries are more concentrated in fewer hands. So there was an opportunity, like there was in 1932 in the Great Depression, and unfortunately, we got more of a Herbert Hoover than a Franklin Roosevelt in 2008. Let's see what happens the next time there's a financial crisis. Certainly, the entire spectrum has shifted further and further to the right. That's the danger in all of this right now.
Obama did not welcome the hatred of the bankers as Roosevelt did. Obama had them on their knees to him. They were on their knees. He could have nationalized banks right then. He could have made huge reforms. It was a once in a generation opportunity, right?
You're absolutely right. And you know something, in the final weeks of 2008 and the first few weeks of 2009, the Financial Times of London had headlines that were remarkable. Headlines such as Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve chairman, calls for nationalizing banks. McCain, Lindsey Graham, these were Republicans that were talking about nationalizing failing banks. Clean them up from the inside. By nationalizing them, you're able to investigate them from the inside without subpoenas, without the lawyers involved. You could find out exactly what was going on, and you could really start prosecuting and start changing the financial system for the better. But, Obama picked Timothy Geithner, who said this is contrary to our traditions. He picked Larry Summers. This is the whole Robert Rubin, Bill Clinton gang, and nothing changed.
Well, Tim, if you want to hang on with us, we have another guest waiting to enter. Her name is Lisa Johnson, and she's written a 5-part series about Assange, the psychology behind getting Assange. You're welcome to. Here's Lisa now. You're welcome to stay as long as you like and to take part in the discussion. We hope that John Kiriakau is going to join us later.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. Yes, I'm sorry. I missed that last part. I'm sorry.
I was just saying that John Kiriakau is supposed to join us again a bit later, and he was the whistleblower, the CIA agent who blew the whistle on torture. You must know about John. So
Yes.
again, it's up to you whether you want to stay with us. But I thank you very, very much for joining us.
I will stay on. Thank you, Joe.
Excellent.
Thank you for having me on, and thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for everything you're doing for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
Thank you for joining us again. And welcome, Lisa. It's good to see you here.
Hi, good to see you too. Thank you for having me on.
Appreciate you getting up so early in Australia to be with us.
Yeah.
So you wrote an amazing series on getting Julian Assange and the psychology behind it. For those readers who haven't read your series, can you outline some of the major basic sort of points that you made in that series to just get them up to speed?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I set out just to write one article, and there was so much in it that it ended up expanding out into 5 parts. And it kind of turned my mind to it after going to a rally in Sydney last year, a Free Assange rally. And I expected there to be coverage of the rally. I expected it to be bad and biased and, part of an extension of the smear campaign that's been going, for so long. But there was no coverage. There was a blackout. So people didn't know that the rally was on. They didn't know that the rally had been on. And that really kind of drove home to me how coordinated and how comprehensive, the kind of media campaign against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is. And at that rally, John Pilger spoke. So it was really amazing that it wasn't covered at all. Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. He's at the centre of Russiagate. That's, all anybody talks about in the corporate media. John Pilger is a really well-known Australian. Silence, absolute silence, that he's there speaking, in support of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. So John Pilger talked about, the smear campaign and some of the low points in Australian journalism around that. And he put it in the context of a 2008 Department of Defence document that outlined a plan to destroy the trust at WikiLeaks' centre of gravity. That was their words. So I came away thinking, wow, that's quite a psychological project for the Defence Department, to go after trust in a publisher. Is that a psychological operation? Not something that I knew an awful lot about, and started looking into that and the relationship between psychology and, the national security state, the current sort of status of that, the history of that. I was looking at job ads for psychologists on the CIA website, to see.
And you're a psychologist yourself, Lisa.
I am, yes. Yes, I should say I'm a psychologist, and I'm also a columnist for an Australian news website called New Matilda. I've been doing that for a few years. And before psychology, I studied media studies and sociology. So I've always had an interest in the interaction between psychology and politics and media. And for that reason, I guess, quite an interest in propaganda and opinion shaping and the psychology of media. So I was turning my mind to all of this from that background. And my PhD in psychology concerned the psychological processes by which one person influences another's beliefs about reality. I was interested in false confessions at the time, so it was about how an interrogator can sort of shape the content of an interviewee's beliefs and memories, both. So, so the same processes basically apply in opinion shaping on a mass scale. When I started looking into, the relationship between psychology and intelligence agencies and the media, I was looking into counterintelligence. This is a cyber counterintelligence branch that set out to destroy trust in WikiLeaks, and read, I think also on the CIA website, that one of the main aims of counterintelligence is to leverage and exploit adversary vulnerabilities. And I thought, well, knowing a lot about the vulnerabilities in human reality processing, given my PhD and my background, I can see all over this decade-long smear campaign against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks that that's really what's happened, that the vulnerabilities in human reality processing have been leveraged and exploited. And, the adversary in that relationship is the public, media consumers, WikiLeaks consumers. So I thought, look, I'll write about that. I'll write an article about those vulnerabilities, about how I see them having been exploited. But in order to do that, I felt established that there was a smear campaign, and that it wasn't just, journalistic failures and jealousy, that it was a coordinated, planned thing that, we can't sort of get behind the scenes, and there's been no leaks about that. So if WikiLeaks had a leak on that, we would know. But looking at it from the outside, I guess I just see the sort of the signs of psychological knowledge all over the smear campaign. And I talked about, in talking about the history between the relationship between psychology and intelligence services, started out by talking about torture, and John Kiriakau, who's coming on, his role in exposing torture. And it's a bit of a case study in A, the importance of whistleblowing, B, what happens to whistleblowers who aren't protected by an organisation like WikiLeaks. John Kiriakau was the one who went to jail for exposing the horrific torture program that psychologists were complicit in designing and implementing, which is a really shameful episode in the history of the psychology profession. But the two psychologists who were responsible for that walked away with an $81 million contract for their consulting company, no criminal repercussions. They got to go on TV and justify torture and endorse Gina Haspel as CIA director. And meanwhile, John Kiriakau was sent to jail. He had to watch after John Kiriakau went on TV, and he's coming on, so he can tell the story better than me, but went on TV and said that, yes, waterboarding is our policy. He was contradicting George Bush at the time. The Senate Intelligence Committee launched a very comprehensive investigation into torture and a long report. And John Kiriakau had to watch the release of that report from prison. So it's a real, it's a bit like Tim's experience. It's a real case study in, the necessity of something, an organisation like WikiLeaks, and the importance of shining a light on these abuses of power, and the fact that you can't rely on the power structures to do the right thing when you do that. It's happening to Tim, it happened to John. The perpetrators get an $81 million contract. The person who blew the whistle ends up in jail and bankrupted, defending themselves. So I sort of started there. Of course, that also was a way of talking about the importance of whistleblowing to democracy. Because John Kiriakau opened the door on, the window on what was going on at the CIA and in the psychology profession, that torture program came to an end. And who knows how many more people would have suffered if he hadn't have done that. And so, it's an example of what WikiLeaks provides to democracy and society, and the importance of whistleblowing to journalism and to the public and to the integrity of, democracy in our society. And so in the next article, I talked about, I also talked about it as a sort of a case study in CIA psychology, and the kind of, what Julian Assange, what we can expect, the sort of treatment we can expect Julian Assange to receive if he is extradited to the United States, given that, torture was going on behind the scenes, and, who knows what else is going on that's waiting for Julian Assange. So, it's a reason to be alarmed, just on a human rights basis and Julian Assange's welfare basis. So then the next article, I thought, well, before I get into the psychological nitty-gritty of this smear campaign, I'll talk about, some of the myths that it's promoted and debunk those. So I was talking there about the importance of omission in psychological operations and propaganda. It's very important to keep out material that contradicts the narrative you're trying to push. And so I went through some of the major omissions, like the sort of detail of the Swedish investigation and what really went on there. And at the moment, one of the major omissions in the media, there's so many, but on WikiLeaks is, as you guys have talked about a lot on these vigils, the consequences for media, for free speech, the dire precedent that it would set for, public interest journalism, and any kind of systemic critique of the corporate state and of the billionaire classes that rule us and own the media to make sure that they can keep on ruling us, and people, don't know what's going on. So, I talked about that, and I mean, people who view these vigils regularly will know that there's been warnings from, current and former senior New York Times counsel that prosecuting Julian Assange would criminalise journalism. Human Rights Watch and Committee to Protect Journalists and ACLU are all on the same page about this. It's not in the media, though, not in the establishment media. And so in the third part, in talking about that, I was talking about Russiagate, and it was before the Mueller report had been finalised. And, Trump opponents and people who've bought into Russiagate and people who are, getting behind the pursuit of WikiLeaks for that reason, blaming Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for Trump's election, feeling so enraged about that, wanting some revenge, I think, is part of it. And I talked about the fact that in that equation, people are placing their trust in intelligence agencies over WikiLeaks, and that makes no logical sense. WikiLeaks has a almost unique, probably is unique, record of 100% accuracy, whereas intelligence agencies have a long history of lies going back to the day dot.
That's such an important point. Yeah.
And now as the accusation of Trump's collusion with Russia is falling apart, my personal view of Russiagate is that that's not Russiagate failing. From a psychological point of view, I think the promise of bringing down Trump was always kind of a psychological tease to get, string people along, bombshell after bombshell after bombshell, so that Russiagate had 2 years in which to really lay down this narrative that American democracy is under attack from Russia and WikiLeaks is in on it, and this is why we need to get Julian Assange. And I have to say, I'm digressing a little bit, but I'm on a psychological level, I'm a little concerned. I think it's a risk at the moment that people who were really invested in that and really invested in bringing down Trump and are now frustrated and disappointed that Julian Assange might become sort of psychologically a second prize, that can be kind of by the opinion shapers harnessed and exploited to keep people behind this Trump administration pursuit of journalism via Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. As you all know, and viewers probably know, it's not just about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, it's about internet censorship and suppressing genuinely independent journalism. So, because, as in the establishment media, as they're talking about there being no evidence of Trump's collusion, they're still repeating this narrative that has equally little evidence, as I know you guys know, you were talking about it last week, that Russia hacked, rather than it being a leak, Russia hacked the emails and gave them to WikiLeaks, and that's being repeated and repeated. So in part 3, I talked about, and that basically comes from intelligence agencies and firms that are kind of intelligence cutouts they all have sort of ties going back to whether it's the NSA or the State Department or the Department of Defense or the CIA. So there's no evidence for that, that narrative that's powering this pursuit of WikiLeaks, but nobody's talking about that in the establishment media. It's being talked about as if it's established fact, as if we know that that's what happened. And that really keeps the pursuit of Julian Assange alive. So psychologically, for people who bought into Russiagate. So in part 3, sorry.
Interrupt for a second, Lisa. Sure. There was a study this week that said that 50% of Americans still believe there was collusion.
Even despite.
What does that tell you in the context of what you're telling us?
Yeah, well, that kind of illustrates what I was saying through the articles when I got into the psychological nitty-gritty of propaganda and how people's beliefs about reality are manipulated, and how intelligence agencies, for, it seems like at least 50% of people have co-opted trust from WikiLeaks to the intelligence agencies, and how on earth did they do that? So when I get into the nitty-gritty of that, talk about the fact that it's a really widely underappreciated fact that human reality processing, reality perception, isn't the logical, factual endeavour that we all experience it to be and think that it is. I mean, of course, it can be. It's possible to, of course, process the world in a rational, logical, fact-based way. But it's really, all human cognition is what psychologists call motivated cognition. So it serves a lot of goals as well as accuracy. So that's true of memory, it's true of political reasoning, it's true of perception of reality. So that 50% fits with that, in that people don't make their judgments about what's true and what's not necessarily based on evidence, unless accuracy is really their goal, and in which case they'll be more careful about how they process things. So there are sort of, that gets into vulnerabilities in human reality processing and how they can be and are, leveraged and exploited in propaganda and in the media and opinion shaping and smear campaigns. And so I talk about in the articles the two main levels being a sort of a deeper motivational, goal-directed, meaning-oriented level, which determines which versions of reality we're susceptible to being fed. And I think that's where so there's that level, and then there's a technical level, which is more about how the narratives are deployed. So that exploits efficiency-oriented vulnerabilities. So our brain often sacrifices accuracy just for speed. So things like repetition, just repeating something over and over and over and over and over and over, causes us to take it as real. So, Russiagate and the smear campaign going on 10 years has exploited both of those levels. And I think that, Joe, that 50% belief, still believing it, is because there's been 2 years for vulnerabilities at both those levels, which I can go into in more detail what they are, but 2 years for those to be exploited relentlessly and repeatedly. And what happens in the end is that really there's a saying that people feel and smell and taste the truth. So what feels viscerally real to people is what they've been being told and what they've been, kind of exploited to emotionally want to believe for 2 years. So a confirmation bias kicks in where it doesn't really matter what evidence people are faced with, what contradictory facts they're faced with. It's just the system, the brain, the psychological system just rejects it. Just call you an apologist or a truther or anything to just push the reality away, or find all sorts of rationalizations and justifications to hang on to the original beliefs, or the beliefs that have been kind of, consolidated and entrenched over. It's really kind of more than 2 years that there's been a Russophobic narrative going on, but with respect to Russiagate. So, I don't know if you want to go into that's a bit more than an overview.
Okay. No, that's great. Thank you for going over that. And I think it's really incredible the way that you've diagrammed that this is not just fake news, that it is so important that these narratives have been pushed for so long. And I think it's great from your perspective to tell the audience that, with your experience is really important.
Yes, because there's a lot at stake. I mean, I agree with everything that was said here. I agree with you, Joe, that I think, essentially, you've said this on these vigils too, that the billionaires are in charge. They own the government, they own the media, and Tim's right at the epicenter of that, and the rot at the center of the sort of charade of American democracy. So good on you fighting that fight, Tim. It's so important. It's just tragic that you're not getting media coverage. But I see why you're not. You and John Kiriakau, I can see why both of you aren't covered, because you're both very sympathetic, likable characters, and people would get behind you and they would really care about your plight, and it would be terrible for the people who need to hang on to power in a corrupt way. So sorry, I lost track of the question.
Part 4 is titled "Why Even Some Lefties Want to See Assange hanged. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, that's where I get into the motivational vulnerabilities that have been exploited. And I mean, there are a few reasons for that motivationally, and it's been most obvious, obviously, since the 2016 election. So one of the main vulnerabilities I talk about there is two main ones, I guess. A thing called system justification and group-based processes. And perhaps the group-based processes is most relevant to the left-right issue, although in 2016 they both were. So human beings it's really deeply wired to view ourselves in the world in group-based terms and hang our identity on our group memberships. I mean, some people more than others. And, there's loads of literature about the destructive sort of impulses and motives that come from that. If groups are put into competition with each other, if people are placed under a circumstance of threat or fear, competition, it's unfortunately quite deeply wired into human beings to become aggressive towards the other groups. So you've got your own sort of the social cultural groups that you belong to, and the other ones that gets called the out group in psychology. And when people are frightened enough, threatened enough, the impulse towards the out group can become very violent, very callous. It's sort of a fight to the death kind of primal cave person kind of a wiring. It's pretty much all intergroup atrocities trace back to that in some way, whether it's war or torture or prejudice and discrimination. So the campaign against Julian Assange has really leveraged that to the hilt by trying to define him, just trying to get the left on board against Julian Assange by defining Assange and WikiLeaks as being on the right or being anti-egalitarian, whether via the Swedish investigation, branding Assange as, sexist and everything that somebody who was egalitarian would dislike and be angry about. And then in the context of the 2016 election, linking WikiLeaks with Trump and with the alt-right and every flavour of right you can think of. And that's been really exploited to harness all of those aggressive, violent
level, visceral anger,
Yeah, and another thing about that for reality perception is that even if you get people and divide them into groups based on the colour of their T-shirt, they will perceive the member of the other group as in a negative light, as untrustworthy, dishonest, unlikable. It's just so wired, unfortunately, into human psychology. So defining Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as an out group makes it a lot easier to, to implant the smears and perpetuate their narratives, because people are inclined to see out group members in a negative light. So it feels more real, and then therefore it's taken as more real. And in terms of the 2016 election, there's a process called system justification, which I think is hugely, I don't just the people who do the research into system justification say it's profoundly influential psychological variable in politics and political information processing. And that is a tendency, there's lots of research into this, that people have to view their social systems, economic, political systems in a favourable light, just like we're motivated to view ourselves in a favourable light, but by and large, not all the time, but on average most of the time. We engage in self-enhancing biases, so the same thing happens at a political level. So people tend to view their societies as good and right and fair and just, and it's other people's societies that are corrupt and anti-democratic and abusive. And one counterintuitive finding of that research that's very consistent is that when people are confronted with flaws in their systems, like they are when WikiLeaks has a release, or like they were in 2016 when it was revealed that the elections were being rigged, that there were these private speeches to Wall Street these promises that there were public and private positions, that you know, they were very damning about American democracy, as is Tim Canova's experience. And for people who are system justifying, which is more the norm than to be system questioning, when confronted with those flaws, rather than critiquing the system, what people tend to do is double down on the system's legitimacy. So you can end up in this sort of ratcheting system where people become more and more closed to reality the more that they're confronted with flaws in their systems. So they sort of bolster and defend the status quo when they're faced with or confronted with its failures and flaws.
We
and
definitely seem to see that so often as a result of this Russiagate scandal and the attack on WikiLeaks, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah, that's been leveraged to the hilt with WikiLeaks. I mean, one of the things I say in 2016, it was American democracy that was exposed as flawed, and Russiagate has just doubled down on the sanctity of American democracy, and this holy institution of American democracy is under attack by evil Russia. And you always need a foreign bogeyman. It used to be, you know, Islam in the war on terror. Now it's Russia in great power conflict. And, you know, before that, when WikiLeaks released the 2010 Afghan and Iraq war logs, then the response then was to double down on the sanctity of the US war machine, and it was under attack by WikiLeaks was said to have blood on its hands. You know, the US military is saying that Julian Assange has blood on his hands. So that's that same thing. The very thing that's exposed as lacking, people are vulnerable to doubling down on the legitimacy of that. And then, you know, in Vault 7, when the CIA was exposed spying on us through our phones and our TVs, the CIA cast itself as under attack from espionage by WikiLeaks. So again, you know, it's that. And it's a way to turn reality on its head. And that's been used with respect to WikiLeaks to get populations to a point now over 10 years where, you know, censorship is a bastion of democracy and free speech is a menace to be overcome. You know, that sort of was what Mike Pompeo was essentially saying in his speech about going after WikiLeaks' free speech values. You know, and you know, war criminals are virtuous and their critics are corrupt, and it's this real inversion. So I think system justifying tendencies are very important in that. And in 2016, because it was the Democrat supporters who were the most confronted with those releases, that I don't think it was just the group-based stuff. I think that system justifying tendency and even sort of justifying the legitimacy of the Democratic Party kicked in as well, and that was hugely exploited in the Russiagate narrative, which is so counterfactual and so illogical. You know?
Exactly. And I hate to interrupt, but I have to add or say that what you're diagramming and what you're describing, you know, it sounds like maybe to some people it might sound like a indecipherable psychological term, system justifying. But what you're really doing is describing and dismantling the Orwellian sort of mindset that is kind of taking over.
Up is down and black is white, and you know, so now we're in this situation where we're imprisoning a publisher for journalism. He's not getting adequate medical care. He's, you know, about to be, well, hopefully not, but he's at risk of being, you know, extrajudicially extradited and detained in this extraterritorial pursuit. And, you know, people are just tolerating it, not seeing it as a really authoritarian, I mean, not everybody, but enough people are not seeing it as the authoritarian, you know, project that it is, and how frightening it is for free speech and for democratic principles. So, yeah. And, you know, just to get back for a minute to that self-deception, the Orwellian, the kind of mechanism that we get into this Orwellian state, the researchers who are responsible for that program of research describe it as essentially a fundamental delusion that, you know, really can drive people to become quite delusional in their perception of reality and the perception of their societies, to the point where our bombs drop democracy. It's only other people's bombs that, you know, that kill people. Yeah. So that's part of that left-right bringing the left on board with this really authoritarian pursuit of free speech and journalism.
So having a two-party system like the U.S. has and driving out any possibility of a third party makes it easier for this to work, as you're describing this.
Absolutely, yes. People hive off into those two camps, and that really does. And like you were saying, that lesser evilism and being frightened of the adversary, having control or winning, really tugs on those group-based processes. Yeah.
Now, speaking of delusions, could you do an individual psychological analysis of a person? Rachel Maddow.
I can't. If I wasn't a psychologist, I could, but we can't comment on individuals. We have to.
Yeah, I know. I figured you'd say that. So let's go on to part 5. I won't keep you on that any longer. I figured you'd say that. Part 5 is about war propaganda 101.
Yes. Yeah. So that was where I talked about the more surface level vulnerabilities that are exploited in propaganda and, psychological operations like an attack on trust in a publisher. And they're more, so whereas the motivational vulnerabilities will differ across people, some people are more prone to those group-based processes or more prone to system justify. The more technical vulnerabilities are pretty much just human. They're kind of shortcuts that our brain takes when we're processing reality, and they're very readily exploited in propaganda and are all the time. And once you know them, it's very easy to spot a serious propaganda campaign. Like Russiagate, just as a lot of people have picked up, like Consortium News and Disobedient Media and other journalists picked that up right at the start. It just screamed propaganda. And there's some fairly simple things that opinion shapers can do to kind of hoodwink the brain into taking something as true and real, regardless of evidence and fact. And one is, one's just sheer repetition. If you repeat something over and 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 over, it becomes very fluently processed, sort of like the world is round. You've heard it so many times before. You just take it as given. In milliseconds, it's in less time than it takes you to muster a conscious thought. Your brain decides, yep, that's true, I can rely on that. So the relentless repetition of Russiagate's been part of that. And then there's a thing called tagging that the brain does to sort of orient us to familiar people and objects in the world. And it's quite a simple process of just using emotions to kind of tag people and things as good or bad. When we encounter something repeatedly, our mind pairs it with an emotion that's associated with that person or thing, which means that a lot of our information processing is actually driven by emotions, not by logic. And there's neuropsychological research into this, that emotions start to influence our thought and action within, I think it's 10 milliseconds, where it takes about 1,000 milliseconds for conscious thought to kick in. So taking something and pairing it constantly with a particular feeling, usually it's fear or anger or hate, means that the minute people encounter that propaganda target, whether it's Russia or Julian Assange, they'll feel those emotions of hate or rage or resentment or even just indifference. And it means that any information that's consistent with that emotion is more readily taken in and received and experienced as true. So, in Russiagate, there's just that relentless pairing of Russia with hacking, Russian interference, Russian collusion, Russian disinformation, and then pairing of Julian Assange with Russia, pairing of Julian Assange with Trump over and over and over and over and over again, so that everybody who's bought into Russiagate, they hear the name Julian Assange, they feel the same anger that they feel towards Trump, they feel the same anger that they feel towards Russia, they feel the same sort of lust for revenge or to topple him that they feel towards Trump. So it's a very simple, sort of obvious thing, but it works, unfortunately, if people are, susceptible to it, which people generally are, unless they're in a mindset where they're really motivated to be accurate. So if your goal is accuracy, or if you mistrust the source, if you think, well, I view MSNBC as a propaganda outlet. I don't trust it outlet. I don't trust anything they say. Then it's not going to work because it comes with a feeling of mistrust. But if you trust the source, you don't have a reason to disbelieve it, and you're not working really hard or particularly focused on being accurate. It's very effective. And so one thing that's happened throughout with WikiLeaks, there's a concept that psychologists call symbolic threat. So there's real physical threat, and symbolic threat is something that's a threat to your culture, your values, your way of life. And when it was the war on terror, Islam was paired with terrorism to make people frightened of Islam, and so any negative information about Islam would be received by the information process, the brain, the reality system. Then, Julian Assange was then paired with terrorism. So that, and now it's Russia, and it's the same sort of tactic. So Russia has been, with this Russian hacking, Russian interference, Russian collusion, Russia's the main sort of symbolic threat now. It used to be terrorism, but now it's Russia, that they want to attack our democracy, our way of life, our values. And there's a fair bit of research around, if somebody or something is perceived as a symbolic threat, people, it's the same as any other kind of threat. People are more supportive of war, of torture. They dehumanize the symbolic threat, which makes them callous to the suffering of whether it was Muslims when it was the war on terror, now Julian Assange. Because through Russiagate, one of the things I see this sort of Russophobia is being used for is Russia's now a symbolic threat. And so Russia's taken and it just as a sort of propaganda brush with which to tar any kind of threat to the status quo as a symbolic threat also, which makes people then callous towards any abuse of that target because of the dehumanization. And that's been used relentlessly against Julian Assange. And I think that's part of why people are sitting around while his human rights are being abused, his health's failing. The UN has said, his life may even be endangered ultimately by this detention because he's not being adequately cared for medically.
And not to interrupt again, but I just want to say that it's so amazing that that the success of Russiagate, like the success of the WMD narrative,
absolutely,
is that what they intended, or what was really desired from those narratives did work. I mean, we had the Iraq War, so even though they were debunked, they were successful in getting the message that the establishment wanted. So sorry to interrupt.
No, yes, interrupt away.
Excellent point.
Yeah, it is an excellent point, yes. And that's my concern with Russiagate supposedly falling apart. I mean, I understand people being excited, and it is, people who've been skeptical since the beginning being excited that there's no collusion, except I think Russiagate skeptics and people who've been pushing it back against it need to be careful to stay on the underlying narrative that's really trying to say that we're under attack from Russia and WikiLeaks is in on it, and we need to go after him, and we need to censor the internet, we need to go after independent journalists who we're calling, Russian propagandists. I think that's that and endless war, I think, are really possibly the two main purposes of this Russiagate narrative, and they're perfectly well in place. As you say, the war on dissent and journalism and independent voices is still there. That's not going away with the Mueller report.
Yes,
and the war.
This attack on Russia is still with us. And you explained so well here why this has been dangerous in terms of geopolitics. This whole Russiagate story. It's not just about an American election. It was about riling up, particularly the American people and others in the West, against a nuclear-armed Russia. This is so dangerous.
It is.
Where people like Rachel Maddow, to bring her up again, even saying at one point that Russia was responsible for shutting off the heat could shut off the heat of people in the Midwest during a cold spell. I don't think she understood how much fire she was playing with.
And there's a fair bit of
your analysis, Lisa, is
somebody
so good,
or something is perceived as a
excellent.
threat.
You could easily, you understand this so well. You could easily get a $161 million contract from the CIA.
Torture.
They'd love you to work for them.
If only there were some good guys to work for, but.
But also on an individual level, not just danger of war, but Russia, you could produce this lunatic who went and killed all those people in the mosques.
Yeah.
That's also a product of all of this, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Well, yeah, I talked about that in part 5 to sort of illustrate this whole pairing and tagging process, that it sounds simple and innocuous, but it's not, because, throughout the war on terror that was used against Islam, just wrongly pairing Islam with terrorism over and over and over and over and over and over and over, such that someone like, I'm sure there were other things going on for him, not just that, unhinged in other ways, but that was a message he got from society and from the media and from politicians, that, and the whole point of that pairing of Islam with terrorism was to justify slaughter throughout the Middle East, the Iraq war in Afghanistan, Syria, all of the atrocities that have been perpetrated throughout the Middle East. So, that horrific massacre in Christchurch kind of illustrates what this is really about, what these smear campaigns and these propaganda campaigns against propaganda targets, that's what's on the other end of it. It is horrific violence and death like that. So you're right, Joe, the consequences are absolutely...
What do you think is the motive behind people who launch these campaigns, like the CIA? They're doing it on behalf of others, not just for themselves.
Yeah.
I have an idea. What do you think? Why are they doing this?
Well, my take on it all is that, there's a billionaire class that's in charge now. They fund politics. They own the media. War's extremely profitable. Governments will pour trillions into it, well, the US government will. And you need the media to manufacture consent for war, because most people are good people who don't want to be responsible for killing other people. So you have to propagandize them into going along with it. So it's, the billionaires need to own the media if they're going to get away with that. And then, there's the economic exploitation. There's just basically billionaires ruling, to in their own interests at everybody else's expense, I think is probably the simplest way of putting it. And I think
it's their interest, their interest, isn't it? They are protecting and furthering their interest through war, through controlling a population that will not rise up against them and start thinking against the system, as you say, critically of the system. They can't have that. Yeah, or else their game is over.
Exactly. So and that sort of uprising that you were talking about.
As independent journalists, we definitely value
that's the risk. If independent media is allowed to thrive, if people sort of really catch on in a big way that they can learn the truth on the internet, and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks can continue to reveal the corruption and the abuse. I mean, that's what's sort of likely to provide hope for the rest of us. Talking about being hopeless before, it's if people have information and can share information and communicate with each other and find out they're not alone in their experience of this neoliberal reality or plutocratic reality, that's a huge threat. So that's why it's so important to shut down independent voices and systemic critique and oversight and accountability.
And on that note, we're also going to bring in and welcome George and Peter, who we want to allow to ask you some questions as well.
And Tim as well.
Excuse me. Tim, if anyone has questions.
If you've been listening, please join in an open discussion on what Lisa's been talking about.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I had read Lisa's 5-part series as well. It reminded me of sort of the political technique of swift voting, where you identify your opponent's strength and you flip it against them. So it really just turns the entire world upside down.
Yes. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that.
Sure. The swift voting it comes from the 2004 presidential campaign between President George W. Bush, and he was running against John Kerry. John Kerry had been a Vietnam veteran, and he had been a decorated veteran during the Vietnam War, whereas Bush had been, I think, with the Texas Air National Guard and had apparently gone AWOL for some days. So the Republicans were expecting that to be used against Bush. So what they did was they essentially, some group was formed called Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. And their whole mission was to denigrate John Kerry's war record and to cast doubt upon it, and to make it, to change the narrative. Instead of him being a war hero, he was somebody who made up his own war record, wrongly got Purple Hearts and things like that. And ever since then, the word swift boating has become a verb for turning the narrative on its head, politically speaking.
Yeah, and it's reached such extreme, and it's gone to such extremes in the last 2 years, hasn't it? It's yeah, for me, watching it, it's almost been like a really sort of gruesome, enormous human experiment in just how far that can be pushed and just how upside down reality perception can be flipped.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how do you flip it back? You know, that independent voices and repetition from is what's needed. But it just seems like independent voices are always outgunned by the mass media.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the real problem, and it just comes down to, it's almost a sort of just a practical problem of delivery and reach, and you know, when that's monopolized. There's fantastic messages out there on independent media, and people, I think, are doing all the right things in terms of reaching people, but distributing that to enough people is the challenge. Yeah.
Well, it's also so important that you know, professionals like yourself who are versed in this area diagram what it is that you diagrammed in this series, and tell us that this is a psychological operation and that this is manipulative and intentional, not just bad journalism, but intentional manipulation of the public.
Yeah. I mean, that would be one really valuable thing that could come out of Russiagate, if levels of propaganda literacy could be raised, you know, because if they were higher, people would have been onto that right from the beginning.
You know, Katie Johnson's been saying all along that Russiagate was a effing psyop. But you have put a lot of meat on those bones. I just want to say.
That's good. Yeah, well, she's been right onto it from the beginning. There's been, you know, lots of fantastic people who have. Jimmy Dore. There's a fellow called C.J. Hopkins at Consent Factory. He's been sort of deconstructing it psychologically all the way through. And Consortium News, of course, and Disobedient Media and Black Agenda Report, and
And Peter B. Collins on his radio show. Isn't that right, Peter?
Well, I suppose so. Thank you, Joe. Yes. How are you today?
I'm fine. Have you been hearing? I hope you heard some of the discussion we've been having.
I have. I've listened for the last 10 or 15 minutes, so I've caught up. And I want to thank Lissa for her report earlier this week. In my coverage, I paired it with Kevin Gostola's update on Chelsea Manning's incarceration in solitary confinement. And we're at a critical stage here. And if I may, I'd like to inject some criticism of the corporate media, because
no, it's not allowed. Not allowed here.
Instant redaction.
Despite the massive fail that is now clearly in evidence on Russiagate, Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, says he's proud of their coverage and doesn't have anything to apologize for. And Jeff Zucker is busy counting the revenues at CNN and doesn't have any time for any examination of their role in promoting this massive fraud. And the ripple effect, you know, I did a podcast, I'm just about to post it, with Peter Van Buren, who's been on the Vigil with you before. And we had a good hour-long chat about this today. And for me, the hypocrisy of the corporate media, specifically related to WikiLeaks, where they were willing to publish material when they thought it would sell papers or glue eyeballs to a screen. But now that Julian and WikiLeaks have been demonized in this phony Russiagate narrative. And we blow past all of the important revelations that came from WikiLeaks that were exploited by this corporate media in their effort to get Trump. And now they are, pardon me, unapologetic. MSNBC has barely recognized, the outlines of the Mueller report. They're busy saying, wow, 300 pages. There's got to be some really good shit in there. And they continue to mislead their viewers. And while those of us who are skeptical may have a moment of vindication or validation, we're paying a price for it, because the effort to clean up the fake news, much of which was promoted and profited on by these same corporate media outlets, that is all occurring at our expense. I'm not the only one who has lost traffic and no longer shows up in search results. And I post a podcast on Facebook, and 13 people out of my thousands of so-called friends are permitted to see it. And so this is all part of a very big package. And we need to be relentless in pushing for, a just outcome for Julian Assange, in rejecting the characterizations that WikiLeaks is some extension of the Russian GRU. And we're caught in the crosswinds as Trump is attempting to capitalize on Bill Barr's spin and filtering. And I accept the, general notions of what Barr has passed along here. But we now have this period of time where Trump, uncontested, can promote this false notion that he was exonerated. And he's a corrupt motherfucker. And that corruption is very clear. He is impeachable, but the Democrats won't touch that because they don't think it will help them in 2020. And so we're reaching a real crisis level here. And I believe fundamentally that justice for Julian Assange is a significant piece of trying to recapture some free speech rights and the momentum that independent media had before this whole scandal was dropped on us.
And speaking of a crisis, we have a crisis of a different variety that is going to be discussed imminently by Cassandra Fairbanks, a journalist who is joining us now and has a limited amount of time, so I wanted to bring her in quickly. Cassandra, if you can hear us and if you're there, welcome. How are you?
I can hear you now.
Great.
I'm doing well. How are you?
In awe of the article that you wrote and the situation that you, described in the embassy. Can you? We read a large portion of your article earlier on the stream in our introduction, but can you run us through again just the crucial points and what it was like in the embassy when you were there recently?
Right. So I went and visited him on Monday, and things have gotten significantly stricter since I visited in January. When I got there, I was 6 minutes early and they turned me away and they were like, no, you absolutely have to come back at the proper time. And I was like, but I don't have a phone or a watch. And they were like, well, and so you could already tell, like right away when I got there, I could tell that the vibe was not going to be very welcoming and that it wasn't going to be the way that it was the first time I visited, which was almost a year ago to the day. It was a few days before he got silenced. So yeah, it immediately started off weird. And then I went in and I got searched, and it was a normal, procedure. They put me into the conference room that has cameras, on one corner and then the other corner, and the whole place, they can see it. It's heavily surveilled. And so he came in, he was like, you have to leave exactly at 5 o'clock, kept, really drilling it in there. And then let's see, I was just waiting and I saw Julian walk by. He was in the he was out in the hallway area, and I could hear him start arguing with them because he didn't want to do the meeting in that room because there was heavy surveillance there, and they wanted him to go through a full body search in order to be able to come in. And he argued that this was, completely unnecessary and things like that. And so then, let's see, a few minutes later, they slammed the door shut. And so I'm like, all right, I'll just hang out here then, I guess. And I was in there for a little while, and then I went to go check the doors so I could get out, and I was locked in. And then I heard Julian outside fighting with the embassy staff because they were refusing to let him come in unless he went through the search. His lawyer couldn't even come in to update me on the situation without being searched. It was a whole ordeal. And then eventually they let me out of the room so that the ambassador could go in there, and him and the ambassador got into quite a heated exchange. And yeah, that, it's pretty much all in my article.
Yeah, no, but what do you have any insight? Like, why do you think they have escalated that level of surveillance and intrusion in the embassy compared with the earlier times that you visited and the other journalists who have come to see Julian Assange?
Well, I mean, the first time I visited, there was completely different staff and a different ambassador, and things were a lot friendlier back then. The new ambassador is clearly not as happy about the situation. I guess this was actually only the second time that him and Julian had ever even spoke, and he's in the same building as him every day. So it's pretty tense there. And obviously the US government has ramped up pressure on Ecuador, and they want to make things as uncomfortable as possible for him so that he'll have to leave. It's very clear what they're doing, and they're certainly succeeding in making it unpleasant.
Now, Kristen Hafrenson, the current editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, compared the situation that you described to a prison cell. And I know in your article, you said that it was reminiscent of the times that you had visited a federal prison. Can you speak about that and the degree to which you think it is accurate to describe the embassy now as a prison cell rather than a place of refuge and asylum?
I think it was actually worse than a prison. It was way worse than visiting people in federal prison. There, you're still under surveillance, but you can whisper, you can chat with each other. I felt like you have more privacy in visiting somebody in a prison, but it was very similar. In a prison, they search the inmates before a visit. They search you before a visit. They put you into a monitored area. It's the same thing. They strictly enforce time limits. They make it pretty uncomfortable. It was the same thing that they're doing in the embassy.
In the prison, there's an exercise yard too, isn't there? And he doesn't have
right.
it.
Yeah.
And there's also medical care, which he doesn't have either. So.
Right. It was depressing. I mean, I only got to speak with him for 8 minutes. And it was, supposed to be 2 hours. So it was quite a situation.
Now, what I really found striking about the insights that you provided in this article is the argument that he had with the ambassador, in which the ambassador told him to shut up. I mean, that is a really extraordinary peek into what's going on there that you provided us, Cassandra, I have to say.
Yeah, when I heard him say that, I almost dropped my pen. I was like, what? Did he just seriously? I thought maybe I was hearing things. And then I heard Julian respond, and he was like, yes, I know you want me to shut up. The president has already gagged me. And I was just like, oh my goodness, this is unbelievable. And then obviously the staff around that point noticed that I was taking notes, and they weren't too pleased. So they turned on the TV with this obnoxious music and just kept turning it up and turning it up and turning it up.
How much longer can this go on, you think?
I don't know. Hopefully not that much longer. Hopefully something will happen and he can be free, but I think they're going to keep escalating the situation until he's either, so uncomfortable and so miserable that he leaves, or they're going to go in there and they're going to snatch him. I mean, that's clearly their objective here. They want to get rid of him, and they're going to make it miserable until they get what they want.
Please, anybody else want to jump in and ask Cassandra while she's with us for the next 15 minutes or so?
I haven't had a chance to read your article. What was the context? Why did the ambassador say to Julian, shut up?
I could only hear bits of the conversation, but what was happening was they were arguing, and Julian accused the ambassador of being an agent of the US government. And at that point, the ambassador got pretty angry, and he fired back, and he was like, I want you to shut up. And that's when Julian was like, yes, I know you want me to shut up. The president has already gagged me, prevented me from doing journalism. And then I couldn't hear much after that, because that was the point when they turned on the TV and made it really loud. And the irony about all of this is that there used to be a white noise machine in that room so that the ambassador and other officials and diplomats could have conversations without people hearing it and without them being able to be spied on. But they took that equipment out so that people could spy on Julian Assange easier. And ironically, I wouldn't have been able to write this article if they still had that stuff in place.
The notes that you took, did they attempt to confiscate your notes, or you're allowed to take the notes out?
No, I would have raised hell over that, but no, they didn't try and take my notes or anything. They tried to prevent me from taking them by making it really loud. And it was funny, before they turned on the TV, there was like a woman walking around pretending to clean, and she was just like jingling the keys really loud, like blatantly. And I was like, all right, guys.
But what this shows is that Assange is still of sound mind. He knows what's going on. He's able to show extraordinary courage to confront the ambassador over these issues, rather than he's not being cowed in any way. I think that was encouraging for me anyway to read that.
Oh no, he's still fiery. He is definitely still fighting, and he is not backing down, and he was fearless. I mean, I was shocked at how strong of a stance he was taking against the ambassador. And he was right about everything that he was saying. I don't think that he was out of line at all.
They're not breaking his spirit. They may be trying to break his body, but they are not breaking his spirit.
Absolutely.
Cassandra, it's Peter B. Collins, and I do want to apologize. Just before you joined us, I incorrectly credited your piece to Lissa. And that was
no worries.
But I was really struck by the bizarre idea that Julian, to move from his living quarters to a conference room, had to be searched. Exactly what did they suspect? He might have picked up a weapon, a recording device. You said he went into the room with a transistor radio to try to provide his own jammer of their surveillance systems. But did they offer any explanation of why they had to search him?
Well, from what it sounded like, he was trying to bring in a radio. And, during previous visits, we have played a radio with static on it just to try and muffle voices a little bit. I wrote about this in my article in January, but back at my previous visit, we used like a notebook, and we were writing notes back and forth to each other. And we had on the little radio so that we could try and, minimize the amount of spying, or at least make it harder for them. Not that we were talking about anything bad, but it was just, it's the principle of it. And so I think that the issue was that they didn't want him to bring in the radio because they wanted to be able to spy very clearly. And I think that they're also worried that because they've gagged and prevented him from sharing any political opinions or any stories or doing any of his work, they're afraid that he's going to give stories or information to other journalists. So I think that was a big part of it too. They didn't want him to be able to pass stories to me. Or, if a story showed up in the news later, they wanted to be able to go back through the conversations and see maybe if he had given it to me or I had passed it to somebody. Basically, they want him completely silent. And so they were making sure that happened.
But from what I understand, he hasn't had any access for a year now. So he could only be working on material that he had in the embassy before he was cut off from the internet a year ago this week, right?
I guess, I don't know.
Uh-huh. Okay,
now, Cassandra, I believe last time you were there in January, and you also spoke to us in the Vigil, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you said you weren't able to really write an article about this, that whatever you talked about to Julian was confidential. It wasn't as an interview to be written about. And you only wrote, you did not reveal any of that. But in this case, you have revealed quotes directly from him. I just wonder, did you have any hesitation to do that? Or did you feel totally free to do that because you wanted the world to know? And I'm glad you did, by the way. But I just wondered what your thought process was about writing this article.
I think that it was really important. I think that he doesn't have any means to talk about the illegality of what they're doing to him and the fact that they are working with the US government against him, even though he is a political refugee. And he's not allowed to express that. And they made it so that he couldn't talk to me to express that. And so it had to be done. And I wanted to make sure that I got the quotes exactly right, and so that there was no room for anybody to question anything. So I wrote it all down. He knew that it was gonna come out because I was like, I'm writing this.
You told him that, I see.
But it's, yeah, during our previous meeting, we talked about a lot of things that, I didn't want to endanger his asylum. But in this case, they made it's their fault that I could overhear all this. If they hadn't gotten rid of the equipment that made it so that people couldn't overhear these conversations, then I wouldn't have been able to write it. It's their fault that I wrote it. So.
Well, and building on that point, I mean, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, Cassandra, I have a question. I'm wondering what the mood was like outside of the embassy. If you got much of a feel for public opinion in Britain about Julian. I know that the Theresa May government could possibly fail sometime soon. If it's replaced by Jeremy Corbyn and a Labour government, maybe that'd be a different British government stance towards Julian. But I am wondering if you got a feel for what public opinion is like in London, or if people just are oblivious to Julian's plight.
I didn't really speak to a lot of people. After I flew in really early Monday morning, and then I went to the embassy, got locked in a room, and then I rushed back to the hotel and wrote an article. And then the next day I went and did some tourist stuff and headed back. So I didn't really get a chance to speak to a lot of people generally about what was going on. There was one incident though that happened that I didn't include in my article. Right when I got to the embassy, there was a guy with a telescopic lens camera standing on the corner, and I was walking down Hans Crescent, and he started taking photos of me like as I was walking, like very blatantly moving his camera. And then I walked about a block and a half to the train station because I was meeting my boyfriend there because he was going to hold on to my phone for me, because I didn't want to bring it into the embassy because they can't be trusted not to bug it or whatever. So I was down waiting for him at the train station for about 5 minutes, and then the guy ended up showing up there too, and he started taking photos of me again there and my boyfriend. So that was a little weird.
He missed Paul Manafort though when he came.
Yeah, imagine that, right?
Did your boyfriend take any photos of? Did your boyfriend take any photos of this person who was photographing you?
I took photos of him.
Yeah.
So
yeah, good.
I didn't end up including that because there was so much that happened that was way more important. But that was just another odd thing. It was just so blatant too. It was like, all right, I see you. Clearly want me to see you, and I see you. And I wasn't sure. I thought maybe it was a reporter at first, but who knows? It was strange. And I feel like there's been a lot of like strange things that happen outside of the embassy.
Well, and building on your point about the fact that, you know, if it wasn't for them removing the white noise machine, you wouldn't have been able to hear a lot of the conversation. It seems like, you know, it's almost as if they've created a situation where, regardless of anything that Assange could have told you about his situation, you know, they created a story that was much more persuasive as to the conditions there than if they had allowed him to speak to you. You know, so it's kind of, it's ironic to me, at least as an observer of the story that you wrote and the mayhem that ensued when he visited.
Right. It was certainly interesting. And then the ambassador wouldn't speak to me. He seemed like personally angry at me when he came out, and I was just like, all right. He like stormed by because I was trying to ask him, I was like, you know, is this treatment specific to me, or are you going to do this to everybody who visits him? Is this the new normal? Are you guys going to body search him and his lawyer every day? But he just
important questions.
Wouldn't even acknowledge me, didn't look in my general direction, stormed past, slammed his door when he went into his office. It was definitely good.
Do they go into his room where he's living and know what he has in his possession, and would know that he couldn't move a couple of meters away from his door to the conference room? Are they aware? Are they entering his room? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. What are his relations like with the rest of the staff? Is there anyone there that he has any kind of decent social relations? Anyone in the embassy staff?
I'm not sure. It seemed pretty icy when I was there. I don't know if it's always like that. I do know that this is only the second time that he's ever spoke to the new ambassador, and he's there every single day. So that's a little strange. It certainly doesn't seem like a friendly atmosphere at all. And I feel really bad for him in that regard, because they're making it so difficult for him to have visitors. And there's not even, the first time I visited, I remember thinking, wow, the people who work here are so cool. Like, at least he has, you know, these people around him that seem really great. Especially the person who had answered the door and searched me and stuff, he was just so nice. And now all those people are gone. So all the people that he had built relationships with or friendly with, or who supported the cause, they're gone. So I don't know, I feel like it's probably pretty lonely.
What is your feeling about a Corbyn government? And did you ever discuss that with Julian? And if you did, can you tell us what he said about that?
I haven't discussed it with him, but even if I did, I wouldn't be able to repeat it because it's political. He's not allowed to have political opinion, remember?
Right.
And
well, he's not allowed to express them anyway. He can't express them. Yeah.
Right.
Well, he has a political opinion that the ambassador is an agent of the United States, but go on, sorry.
Right.
Does he at least have a radio or a television that he can listen to, watch, so at least he knows what's going on in the world?
Oh yeah, I'm sure that he definitely knows what's happening in the world. He's not totally clueless. He stays very up to date.
Well, and for our viewers who maybe didn't catch the introduction and who don't know the changes that have been made since he was isolated last year, where he was completely cut off and no journalists could go see him. Now, the Ecuadorian government has instituted this protocol, which is a very complex set of rules where, as you say, Julian Assange is not allowed to speak about politics. He's not allowed to function as a journalist. Could you describe the type of rigor in this protocol that you had to follow in order to even visit? For example, like leaving your cell phone behind.
Okay, so they give you an application to fill out. You have to provide, where you work, your employer's address, phone numbers, all that kind of information. You have to provide your social media, your IMEI number, your serial number for your phone number, all sorts of data, just an absolutely ridiculous amount of stuff. So I opted to leave my phone behind because I did not want to give that information to the Ecuadorian government. But if you wanted to bring that stuff in, you would have to hand it over. The other option, if you don't provide the serial number and things like that, is to leave your phone with them at the front desk. Wasn't something I was going to do. But yeah, apparently he's been having a hard time getting visitors approved. there was somebody who wanted to visit him who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner. They got denied. They thought that I was going to get denied because of the article that I wrote in January where I said that he was Stasi-style surveillance. So we didn't even think this was going to get approved, but they did. I doubt that they'll approve me again now, but yeah, it's definitely a much more difficult situation for him to have visitors, and everything has to go through the ambassador. They even wrote on my on the letter of approval that we had to stay in this room because last time we had attempted to go into another office so that we could speak without the blatantly obvious cameras in our faces. And they were very upset about that. So they made sure to write it in bold on my acceptance letter that it was exclusively in the conference room. But yeah, it's definitely not a comfortable situation for him or for the visitors. So
yeah, no, absolutely.
Rambling.
No, not at all. It's really important to have your experience, broadcast to as many people as possible through your article and through talking to us about it. So.
Yeah.
So Lisa, do you have any do you have any questions or comments on Cassandra's experience from, as a psychologist and after having written the series that you did?
Well, it's driving home to me. I mean, one thing that was going through my mind as I was listening to you speak, Cassandra, was this is really something that psychologists should be, I think, speaking out about, because we're talking about somebody here being abused on so many levels, human rights being abused, civil and political and legal rights being abused. And it just seems like a logical place for psychology to be standing beside leading human rights organisations saying this is wrong. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and Cassandra going and visiting him, Cassandra, and explaining to everybody what it's like there really drives it home in a human way. So I hope that it's and it makes it more accessible and relatable to people. So I hope that will move some more people to stand up and stand beside the organisations that are already denouncing this and saying that it's wrong to treat a journalist as a prisoner. And I guess the other thing there that really sort of invites psychologists to take a stand is that it sounds like they're trying to psychologically force him out, make it so psychologically unbearable for him that he leaves. That's another thing that was going through my mind as you were speaking. So I think it's a really important story for people to hear, and I hope it moves some people who haven't come forth yet to come forth.
Yeah, no, it really seems like instead of having the kind of maybe public backlash to some degree that would ensue if they forcibly removed Julian Assange from the embassy, they're using the embassy as a prison by proxy for the US government, and they're trying to make it so uninhabitable that he's forced to leave and do that work for them. It definitely seems to be something that Cassandra's story is communicating loud and clear.
Well, thank you, Cassandra, for spending a half an hour with us.
No, thank you guys for having me.
And thank you for that article.
Anytime. Hopefully, I'll be able to go back and get another update, but I'm not going to hold my breath for an approval this time. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. I have to run.
Yep.
Not a problem.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it a lot.
Later.
Yeah, appreciate it that you made the time to come join us.
Thank you.
So, George, give us your thoughts about the end of Russia, the collusion, conspiracy theory, and how it impacts this story.
Well, I think the irony is that a triumphant Trump is even more likely to go after Julian Assange. He sees this as a vindication, and he really doesn't care one bit for Julian Assange. And I think that this is part of the Trump administration's crackdown on the media. And I think they're absolutely determined to go after him and to distinguish themselves from the Obama administration. And so, yes, we're going to do what Obama dared not do. We're going to bring down Julian Assange. So I think in some ways, I think it's actually makes things even worse for Julian Assange, because I think it's just reinvigorates the Trump administration's war against independent media. And I think that
could I ask you a question? May I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
See, vindicating Julian Assange as a way to destroy the Democrats.
Well, I mean, I think that the problem there is that the people around Trump, Pompeo, Bolton, they have hated Julian Assange from the beginning. I mean, when he first emerged on the scene, they have absolutely hated him. They see him as undermining America, destroying the American institutions, revealing things, and destroying everything that America is about. The Democrats really only joined this bandwagon a little later. First, when they saw WikiLeaks as being vaguely against Obama, but in particular after 2016. So there's really a kind of a happy consensus going from right to left of a total unremitting hostility towards WikiLeaks. So it's true that during 2016, Trump was kind of exuberantly saying, "I love WikiLeaks," but he really didn't mean very much by it. He was just delighted that there was stuff appearing on WikiLeaks that was damaging to the Democrats or Hillary Clinton. But that was about it. I mean, he didn't really think very much about it. And then once he was president, he was obviously took the whole intelligence view of the world, which is WikiLeaks is really terrible because it's publishing secrets that are undermining what America is all about, weakening us, weakening the military, and so on. So that's Trump's view. Trump's view is now pretty much the view of Bolton and Pompeo.
It's funny you say that, George, because what WikiLeaks is all about is actually bolstering what America is all about. If America is supposed to be about democracy and freedom, what it is an existential threat, not to the U.S., but to those guys personally, to their power, to their interests, all the people in the intelligence agencies, people like Pompeo and etc. And you're right to say, I think that Trump doesn't care. I think he's checked out on this. I wouldn't say he's the ringleader at all on the Assange thing. He doesn't give a damn, and he's allowing his intelligence people and Pompeo to run the show on this, and he'll turn the other way. Very good point. He's kind of the way he treats his contractors. He's probably nice to them while they're doing the work, and then when they stop, he doesn't pay them. So in this case, he thanked Assange for those emails, and now that he doesn't need him anymore, doesn't give a damn, right?
Right, exactly. Now just toss him over to Pompeo and all the rest. Yeah, do with him whatever you want. I don't care.
Yeah.
Terrible. But Trump has never pretended to be a friend of the media. I mean, he's never been a First Amendment person. That's just not what he's about.
He's actually been very skillful manipulator of the media in New York City, where I grew up. He was on the front pages of the tabloids every day. He understands reporters, at least that level of reporting about his personal life, about his business, because he was always portrayed as this genius, as this wonderful guy. He got on all these TV shows in the 70s and 80s, and they always asked him, by the way, are you going to run for president? Yeah. And he would say, no, I don't really think so, but if I do, I'm going to win. And the son of a bitch won. So, but he knows how to manipulate. But he came up against something much bigger than the New York tabloid press when he came to Washington. Because he's not dealing with just reporters, he's dealing with the intelligence officials standing behind the reporters, whispering to them what to write, what to say, how to view him. And that's what he's really up against, was the intelligence. But and that's the thing. He should be a person who is critical of the intelligence agency to the point where he would not buy their story necessarily on WikiLeaks. But you're right, he also portrays himself as being a defender of the American way and the values and all that crap, which is their own skins that they're trying to save here. They conflate the two, don't they? National interests. It's not about national interests. It's about their interests. It's about national security. It's about their own security.
Of course. Because the information that WikiLeaks publishes undermines their position. They're saying, you know, everything that you have been telling us is a pack of lies. You know, you've got us into one war after another, one disastrous intervention after another, based on a pack of lies. And that's what they don't like. It's nothing, you know, it's not national security, any sort of government secrets that you know, endangering sources and methods. No, what's being endangered is the reputation of people like John Bolton. I mean, of course, Bolton hates WikiLeaks. I mean, this is an absolute walking disaster. I mean, every disastrous policy that the U.S. has been involved in over the last 20 years, or in fact, probably longer, going all the way back into the Iran-Contra days, everything, you know, always John Bolton is there. And yet there he is. He's still at the top of the U.S. government. Of course, he doesn't want WikiLeaks to be publishing material about going back to the Reagan years and so on. Yeah, it stands to reason. I mean, it's his own self-interest.
Well, they won't be able to go to war in Venezuela if somebody like WikiLeaks keeps revealing how they're always lying to get us into wars, because they're lying about this one. Even the New York Times revealed one of their lies about the burning of that aid truck. So they have to stop. It fits into what Lisa was saying before, that the people will continue to believe these lies over and over again, even with the existence of WikiLeaks, but they can't take that chance. They got to stop the possibility that people may wake up because of WikiLeaks.
Yes, that's exactly right. We can go to WikiLeaks website right now, type in Venezuela, and we will go have a list of document after document of U.S. intervention since 1998, attempting to overthrow first Chavez and then later on into Maduro. All of that is in WikiLeaks. All of those documents, everything that the U.S. government was doing in Caracas, all their dealings with the Venezuelan military, their involvements in the coup, and everything, it's all there. All those documents are there. I mean, nobody does it. You know, the media don't bother to do it, but it's all there, just a few clicks away right now, and you get the entire sordid history of U.S. attempts to overthrow the government in Caracas, and then, you know, going back, you know, this is going back several administrations. Trump is just continuing with all of that.
Well, including the documents, I believe, that was from the CIA that WikiLeaks had published that showed the politically motivated use of blackouts, electrical blackouts that we've just seen happen. So sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
No, that's exactly right. No, that's all of that is there. And so we're asked to believe that all of a sudden, lo and behold, blackouts. Everything is suddenly going wrong. What a strange coincidence. Elliot Abrams appears on the scene, and right away there are blackouts. and all manner of other disasters. So
yeah, Marco Rubio was tweeting about it like 5 seconds after it happened.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, of course they don't want any of this information out. So we can actually check up that whole dismal history of U.S. interventions, in Venezuela, but also in other places in Latin America. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, WikiLeaks is not endangering any national security. It's just endangering the career paths of some various people at the top levels of the U.S. government.
Precisely. That's why they want to get them.
Yeah.
They're motivated by personal revenge, hatred, and they want to stop him. Stop WikiLeaks. They can continue to do what they want.
And that brings me back to Lisa's article. I believe was the first part where, we've had statements from Rafael Correa, the previous president of Ecuador, saying that he feels that the current treatment of Assange is torture. But what you wrote about, Lisa, included the description of CIA torture, and it's really horrifying to think that level of torture is the type of thing that we might see happen to Julian. And I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about that.
certainly hope not. But it does speak to kind of the lengths to which, you know, intelligence agencies are willing to go psychologically to get what they want, and, you know, to break people and to which is, I mean, they're doing all they can at the moment with Julian Assange, you know, in a different country, in the Ecuadorian embassy, and it's it's not pleasant thinking about what they might have up their sleeves.
How does somebody like Julian withstand that kind of psychological pressure? I mean, this goes on year after year. I mean, even for what Cassandra was saying today, I mean, he's living in that embassy, and the people around him are all hostile to him. So it's not like he even have, you know, banter with a few people.
Yeah,
during the day.
It would be awful. Yeah, it would be awful, and that's why solitary confinement is so horrific for people, because we're social animals, and it's really, really unbearable for people. I don't know. I mean, John Pilger is constantly saying that Julian Assange has extraordinary resilience, and, you know, can only sort of underline that. It's a rare person that would be able to cope with what he's coping with. So, you know, whatever he's got, if he could bottle it and spread it around, the world would be a different place. Yeah, but it is extraordinary that he's still got such spirit and fight, it sounds like, based on what Cassandra said. And I think John Pilger said something similar on one of these vigils, that he's staying strong psychologically. So you get the impression that the intelligence agencies didn't quite know what they were dealing with. I think they probably thought they could, and Ecuador thought they could break it more easily than they have. But yeah, what drives his resilience, I would only be guessing, but it's extraordinary.
Yeah. Because there have been other people who have been in that situation. I mean, you think of, you know, Cardinal Mincenti in the U.S. embassy in Hungary, which was, you know, almost 15 years, but that was a pretty friendly environment. I mean, not just that. I mean, the U.S. embassy was obviously much bigger than a tiny apartment in opposite Harrods. He was able to get fresh air, but he was also in an environment in which he had sympathetic people around him, because the U.S. embassy was full of anti-communist people. Mincenti was anti-communist, so there was a natural rapport, however annoyed they found him. But this is very different. He's cooped up with people who don't want him to be there.
Yes, I mean, that would make a huge difference, an enormous difference psychologically, having like-minded, supportive people around you. Yeah, and I mean, I understand that he's in physical pain as well, and that would make it even more unbearable psychologically. Yeah, and you know, not being able to do what he likes to do and what he's good at, his journalism and communicating with the outside world. They're certainly doing everything they can to break him, but it's a huge testament to him that it's not breaking him. Which is, you know, as I say, I think a lot of psychologists probably just don't really know, because they probably read mainstream or, you know, corporate or establishment media, but I hope that more psychologists will sort of denounce this kind of psychological mistreatment and using psychological abuse to try to break a journalist and publisher, to deliver him into US hands for persecution.
Have there been psychologists who have spoken out about this, other than you?
Not that I know. There's a group called Psychologists for Social Justice, I think, in Ireland, who tweeted out the articles with a supportive comment, which was good. That's heartening. Let me think. Well, Nozomi Hayes, is that how you say her name? Who's on these vigils? Is she a psychologist? She's got some.
I believe she has a PhD from Pacifica. Yeah.
So there's her.
I believe. But in your perspective, what can the viewers, supporters do to kind of combat that success of Russiagate in weaponizing the public and their public opinion at that gut level against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks? Because I've seen supposed supporters of WikiLeaks actually tweet things like, well, if WikiLeaks was an asset of state power for the Kremlin, then they're working as a weapon for the Russian government. So what can we do to reverse that narrative or to address it in a like actually tangible way, if there's anything that you
day-to-day life?
Yeah.
Well, you know, arm yourself with facts and sort of know them, and you know, don't be afraid. I mean, one thing that I wrote about that we haven't talked about today, that's operating to prevent people from doing that, to prevent people from speaking up and saying what they think, is you know, people getting, psychologists call it derogated, but just abused for speaking up. That's an impulse, another helpful impulse for propagandists that human beings have. That if somebody speaks up about, you know, their group's wrongdoing, they're perceived as, by a lot of people, as kind of dislikable and annoying and offensive and arrogant, and all, so they get attacked in a personal way. So I would say, you know, expect that, and if it happens, don't be put off by it. Just understand that means that you're doing a good job. You're hitting a nerve. You know, wear it as a badge of honor.
Absolutely.
Don't
Well,
let it down, and you know, just be non-confrontational but persistent. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that it's just so common that the people who do raise their head above and try, from an independent perspective, try to, you know, address that, they do get attacked from multiple fronts.
And it can happen to people in their private lives, friends, family, express an opinion, and the same thing happens, which isn't pleasant. But if your psychologists like to reframe things, so if you reframe it in your mind as a sign that you're getting through, because what some research on that says that although people will react and abuse you, they do go away. The more they abuse you, really, the more likely they are to go away and change their behaviour. So the argument is that if you want to be a moral advocate, you need to wear the backlash in order to achieve change. So that would be my main piece of advice, just whatever will help you to sort of get a thick skin to that, to know that you're getting through and you're getting somewhere if people are abusing you, which is a sad
I bet you all of us here have lost friends over Russiagate.
Well, and you know, people like Tim can absolutely, go ahead.
No, I was saying we all lost friends probably over Russiagate, and they weren't friends worth having, as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly.
Well, and the metaphor of like the abuse, like the abuse that you mentioned, that metaphor is like of the DNC and the media as the abuser in, you know, like as, you know, happens in relationships and that type of thing. Like the DNC is an abusive spouse is something a lot of independent journalists like Caitlin Johnstone have talked about really eloquently. So
she has, and I agree with that. There's a real parallel process, and where the abuser convinces you that up is down and black is white and it's your fault and you're crazy and you're seeing things the wrong way around and you can't trust your own eyes. And then the censorship is part of that, because part of that, Caitlin probably talked about that too, is to cut people off from the outside world and prevent them from talking to people who will, you know, affirm their perception of reality, and they know they're not going crazy. This is really happening. So that's why it's important to shut down, you know, oppositional voices on the internet and independent journalists, and smear them. Promote.
We're still going here. We're still going.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank goodness for.
Although they restricted now Susie Dawson's Twitter account today.
I did see that her Twitter account is back up, but she had tweeted that she was simultaneously locked out of Facebook. She had to enter her, you know, information there as well. So we saw the same thing. A similar thing happened to Christine Assange's Twitter account last week. So
what was behind that? Why did they restrict Christine Assange's account?
They never told her. They never explained anything. There was no communication with her whatsoever. She told me that herself. So she doesn't know. We can guess. I don't know. Yeah, we just don't know. It happened, and it happened to Susie, and it happens to. It's not happening to. I don't know who it's happening to, but people associated with this movement here are getting picked off. At least for a day or two. That's just maybe sending a message.
Right.
This is
definitely.
We don't know.
Definitely not Maduro. I mean, sorry, definitely not Marco Rubio, who tweeted those images of Gaddafi and Maduro side by side.
Yes. Well, we've had a great. Yes, go on, George.
No, I was just going to say that what Lisa said about repetition and how powerful that is as a psychological tool. Just keep repeating the same thing. And whatever doubts that anyone had before are just dispelled because you're saying, well, look, I mean, this is now accepted. I mean, it's like, you know, who am I to question this? Because this is now accepted by everybody. Russia hacked the U.S. election. So, you know, you've never seen the evidence. You know, what evidence there is, it was all made by, are claims made by people who are totally disreputable. Brennan, Clapper, Comey. These are the three people who actually made that claim about Russia hacked the 2016 election. But it's now been repeated so many times that it's now accepted. And if you question, well, I don't know if, you know, I'd like to see some evidence of Russian intervention, then you really are just a flat earther. You know, you're not worth talking to. You know, you're just a crazy person. I mean, you're nuts.
There were a couple of guys in Germany in the 1930s who figured that out. If you keep repeating a lie over and over again, you'll be believed.
Exactly.
Yeah, and people do become really closed to facts that go against what, you know, has been bedded down by repetition, no matter how compelling or convincing or logical. But I mean, George, you're right that people could do that in their personal lives, though. Just keep repeating the facts.
It's funny. I have an insight into Robert Parry, who, of course, founded the late Robert Parry Consortium News. He worked under in that he repeated his stories over and over again. He would write the same things, different angles on the same theme over and over again. And I was talking to his longtime assistant about that, and she said, yes, that was a conscious strategy of his to try to drive the truth. So in a way, he was using an opposite way. He was trying to put truth out there, or facts anyway, and keep repeating it so it would penetrate. So that's something maybe we can do as well. Just keep repeating until we sound, even if we don't like the sound of our voices anymore.
I absolutely agree.
No, I mean, I absolutely, exactly, because repetition is effective. I mean, there's no question. It is a very effective psychological tool. If you just keep hitting somebody over the head with it until he gets the lesson. Oh, okay. Now I've accepted this as, part of my system of ideas.
And it starts to feel familiar, and so people let it in. It doesn't feel alien, and it doesn't feel, like it goes against the grain of what they're accustomed to hearing.
Yeah, it's like advertising. You hear the beginning of the same ad on radio or TV all day long, over and over again, even if it's just for a week. That's probably enough. Just have it sink in.
It reminds me a little bit of the old Soviet Union. You had plenty of censorship, obviously, and official propaganda. And by the end, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the people who lived there didn't believe any of the propaganda anymore. It was like a completely different conversation that people would have at their dinner tables or with their friends, that they just didn't believe the propaganda that was happening, that they were being fed on, official television. Because I suppose their realities departed so much from what the propaganda was. Now, there's this moment happening now where the ratings for MSNBC and some other of the liberal media is beginning to fall pretty dramatically, at least in the first few days since the Mueller investigation announced its findings. It could be one of those moments of cognitive dissonance where a lot of folks start questioning the narrative that they've been fed. And, you can look back all the way at the Kennedy assassination, where still on official, media, official media, I mean, the corporate elitist media, New York Times, and the way it'll be reported on television, whenever they refer to the John Kennedy assassination, it's matter-of-factly, the official version. And yet the public opinion polls show that consistently for many decades now, 70 to 80% of the public just doesn't believe the official narrative on the Kennedy assassination at all. Unfortunately, I don't think we have decades to help Julian Assange. It's obviously reaching a more critical moment.
And yet they believe 50% of Americans still believe that there was collusion between Russia and Trump campaign.
But 50% believe there was not. And my guess is it's an improvement in that direction in the last few days or weeks, right?
I should hope so. I should hope so.
Yeah, it is an opportunity. And what you say, Tim, is right. Well, psychology would predict that on that notion that people feel and smell and hear the truth or see the truth rather than, absorb it intellectually, that when people's realities are so different to what they're being fed, when they're living it day to day and they can see that this is not the reality, that I know, I mean, that's when you would expect it to start to give and to shift. So, seeing Russiagate having been a lie or a false promise for 2 years might be an opportunity. You're right, yeah.
I would say that the American system of propaganda, if we could use that word, is far more sophisticated than the Soviet Union's was. Even back then, the Cold War, it's more successful. They have studied this in a way that's frightening. And I'm also glad you brought up the Kennedy assassination with 3 minutes to go on our show. So it's not a topic, not one we could talk easily about in such a short period, but it's a good example, though.
And I know that Consortium News had published, or at least republished, that call of 50 signatories to reopen the investigation into that, if I remember correctly, as well. So
it's all 4 assassinations:
right.
the 2 Kennedys, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X.
Yes.
And Robert Kennedy's son was one of the people driving that. So it's not something we write about a lot, but we we certainly back that call.
Definitely.
So I think it's time to wrap up, and we're just sort of chatting, lying around here after the dramatic scenes that we've had here and chatting a little bit. But we've got 2 minutes to go. I want to really thank Tim for coming on. He really contributed an enormous amount. Lisa, it's impossible to thank you for what you've written, and I know you seem to be a little camera shy, but you did extremely well.
Oh, that's good.
You
I feel like I'm a better writer than speaker, but that's good.
Yes, you did extremely well.
Especially so early. I mean, I think you deserve to have the audience know that you were up, with us at 7 and 8 a.m. your time. So
it's true. Yeah,
appreciate
on a Saturday. On a Saturday,
yeah. On a Saturday, yeah. That's right. Anyway, thank you for having me.
I'm in awe of all of you and for everything that you've all been doing. So thank you for having me on.
Well, Tim, you're welcome back anytime you'd like, because there's always something to talk about in this story, and it's getting, as you said, more and more critical. George, you too. I want to see you again on this program.
Good. Yep. Good to see you all again.
My co-host, Elizabeth, a stellar job again. Thank you.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you so much. Right. And I believe that as we close out this week's Vigil, we'll be trying to play a stream that happened at the beginning of our Vigil. Nico House, an independent journalist and somebody who's Tim is very familiar with, a progressive activist who was, instrumental in the beginning of the DNC fraud lawsuit and, very, very active in the South Florida area, has interviewed Tulsi Gabbard, and Tulsi Gabbard was making some comments about WikiLeaks and supporting WikiLeaks that it was recommended that we play. And I'd love to play that clip at the end of this Vigil to close it out for you all, for those who are watching this stream and who maybe missed it. So, but if anybody would like to say anything else before I do that, please feel free. But it's been a crazy, intense couple of weeks as far as developments with Assange. I mean, we barely even got to mention the fact that what WikiLeaks tweeted yesterday regarding, the Ecuadorian government's claim that Assange should be expelled or arrested for retweeting a scandal regarding, Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno. So, yeah, it's a lot of developments to keep an eye on. Can't imagine what we'll be looking at next week.
No.
But right now, I'm going to open that video so that we can play it for you all, and hopefully we won't have much of a problem sharing the audio as well. One moment. Can you all hear this?
So we're getting closer. Very weakly.
Okay.
The integrity
There.
There you go. That's better.
That were counted. Plus, they had the highest.
Can you make it
turnout that
full
they've ever
screen,
had in
Elizabeth?
years.
Wow.
So for people to say, "Well, this is too big," it can't. No, Virginia did it in several weeks.
It's not big at all. I mean, it's paper.
Exactly. Exactly.
It
is a simple solution and an important one.
Really quick, how do you feel about ranked choice voting?
You know, I'm learning more about it. It's something that a lot of folks are bringing up now more in the town hall meetings that we're having, really raising the concern that we want to make sure that our choices as voters are accurately represented through our voting system, and people concerned that that's not the case now. So I think it's an issue that I think more people need to be educated about in order to really consider it seriously.
Is it getting any momentum in Congress right now as we're trying to?
I mean, look, that's what we're working on. You know, there are some issues that were just raised in Georgia. A lot of issues that, I mean, look, that are raised in states that don't use paper ballots at all. They don't even have that option for people. So if there's no paper backup, again, the vulnerability has been exposed. We're offering a bipartisan solution that I think could be passed very quickly. So your guys asking the questions and giving me the opportunity to talk about it does a lot to be able to help raise that awareness.
Sorry, I'm just changing the timing of this. I believe the clip that we're looking for is at about 24 minutes. One moment.
Millions of dollars to get that insulin in, so it really affects the poor people. I'm so sorry. No. Before you do that, I want to let everybody know that you're what, 15,000 donations away.
Yeah,
now?
we just crossed the 50,000 mark in the individual contributions that we need to get on the DNC debate stage in June. So we're getting closer, but we still need.
So everybody who's watching, you can literally donate $1. Get your family to donate $1. Clearly, if you're listening to this, you can clearly see she needs to be on the debate stage like 2 days ago. So, but go ahead, Craig.
Well, you know what? You should do your last question because I'm gonna do the 60-second lightning round to get us out of here.
All right, it sounds good.
Why don't you go ahead?
So, journalists, especially as independent journalists, we definitely value like objectivity and journalistic integrity and protecting journalists away from like tyrannical governments. With that being said, Julian Assange is going through some clearly secret process that we can trust him. Do you feel as if Julian Assange is not being treated as a journalist? And how would you handle situations like this, where we found out our government is, acting illegitimately and illegally and unlawfully in a lot of ways internationally, but instead we're punishing the people who are allowing us to know that we're not keeping our house clean.
Yeah. I actually put out a tweet on this, and I don't know if there's any way to find it and bring it up quickly on screen, but it directly addressed the importance of the freedom of the press, how this is enshrined in our Constitution, and how dangerous it is that this administration is trying to, and very publicly, designate WikiLeaks as a foreign intelligence agency, and therefore opening up to a whole host of other negative actions coming from our government. It is dangerous when we have people in our own government who hear things from independent journalists, for example, or don't like the things that folks are saying, and then can do things like, hey, let's designate them as a foreign intelligence agency just to shut them down. So that's something that we have to, we can't be complacent. We can't be complacent about. And again, we've got to call it, because I think a lot of folks in the country probably don't know a lot about what's going on or don't understand what's going on. But we have to call it out for what it is, because this isn't something that just affects one person or one entity. This is something that threatens the very freedoms that this country stands upon.
All right, 60-second lightning round. Go ahead.
You want to do it right now?
Go ahead.
60 seconds. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
60 seconds.
All right.
I'm gonna give you a couple.
I believe that is the end of that section where she's speaking about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. So with that, I'll thank everyone who's joined us as panelists and everyone who's joined us to watch. The audience is always appreciated, and we'll see you next week at the same time. Bye, guys.
Bye.